Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If with another fanfiction. This is the fourth part of What If Deku Became Shigaraki's Obsession? All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Mr. Yamada, how come the Class 1A monitor is down? The imposter Midoriya asked. All the screens for the General Studies course were assigned to watch were working perfectly fine except for the ones that were meant to be broadcasting the activity in the USJ. Yamada began fiddling with the volume and wires behind him the monitor. Perhaps it was just something with the screen. So he tried to turn on the USJ footage on a different one only to see a blank image. He began trying to switch for different camera views and every single one was turning up black or static. Maybe there's no good signal out there, Yamada muttered to himself. Sorry Midoriya, guess you'll just have to take notes on something else. Why not Class 1B? They got some rockin' quirks too. He smiled enthusiastically. But he continued to keep pressing at the blank monitor. How odd that it wasn't working. The fighting displayed at the USJ by pro hero Eraserhead had amazed all the students watching. A tired teacher, always annoyed by the children he was forced to be with, was beyond an impressive fighter when it came to protecting them. Aizawa's binding scarf paired with impressive athletic agility and quick wit was showing how he had become a pro hero in the first place. Glowing eyes with hair pushing up and back on his head, his ability to keep himself from blinking underneath yellow goggles made him a threat that even Midoriya did not take into account. Shigaraki had gone to so much trouble to recruit so many grunt-level criminals and he was already watching a fraction of them being taken down by a singular hero. Aizawa was as competent as he was skilled. Leaping and running head-on but also evading attacks ranging from fists and feet, but vines and bullets as well. His eyes darted left and right, above and below. It would only take a moment to erase then restrain before immobilizing. He didn't need a flashy costume, he didn't need armor, his speed and reaction time was all the power he needed for this fight. But for now, this fight wasn't about defeating and arresting. This was about protecting the students he still had. While being targeted from every direction, he defended himself well and made his presence known as a threat to the villains. He was aware of the king of the chessboard in the back, behind these pawns that only posed as fodder. Were the grunts' only purpose to wear him down? Why were there so many? Was the real mastermind amongst them? He thought not. Not with the monster with a child sitting gleefully on its shoulder. But which one was in charge? Which one stole Kosuka's life? Who were they after this time? Teenagers were so troublesome. Noisy and immature, they could be such a pain. But their lives were precious. They had big hearts and bright souls that were full of the potential to make the world a better place. Teachers were meant to guide them through their phases and changes, leading down the path that was best for them and help them accustom themselves to the difficulty of the future. But in a world of villains and heroes, with a merciless killer hidden amongst those around him, Aizawa was going to protect those teenagers with his life. He knew full well that 13 understood the same. What happened to Kosuka would never happen again within these walls. While using his scarf to grapple a villain and use him as a meat shield, he took a moment to look back up the cliff where 13 was still with his class. They'd protect them. He trusted them. Shigaraki had his arms folded and was looking around curiously, almost annoyed. Midoriya also looked around but his vision must have been skewed from the mask. Do you see him? Shigaraki asked. Where was All Might? He was nowhere to be found. That's what they were here for, that's what the Nomu was here for. That's not right. This can't be right, this is his class. You don't think he's still being held up from our detours? Midoriya answered. Maybe he should have never displayed Kosuka's body for the school to see. Perhaps they were paranoid and told All Might not to come to the Uhi. Whatever the cause, the fact was that their target was not in the vicinity. How annoying, we might as well just leave. Shigaraki grumbled. We'll just have to lure him out. We can't just turn back so soon. Midoriya cried out, hugging Nomu's beak. They brought the Nomu and did so much work to get to this point. They couldn't abandon the mission. All Might had to die. Midoriya looked up the cliff where the students and 13 watched Aizawa. But we can't let them interfere. If any of the other students were to be killed in the process, they could kiss the plan of getting Todoroki to their side goodbye. Though the chance that Ida could die by Midoriya's command, it filled the little villain with excitement. We can try to lure him out by Midoriya was going to suggest, but it appeared that Shigaraki had another idea. Or we can make our presence known even more than before. They'll know we were the ones that destroyed their precious sense of fake security. Kurogiri looked between the two and then up at the cluster of students. They're becoming restless. It'll be troublesome if they get close to our fallen one. The Nomu would attack anyone that was a threat to Midoriya. It would likely kill a student in a single motion. You should take care of that then. Scare them. Make sure they won't want to get close. Shigaraki answered as he flexed his hand a bit. How frustrating. It would be so much simpler if All Might was present. But they would just have to do what they could. Isn't there something we can do? Kirishima asked 13 as they were all just standing there, watching Aizawa doing all of the work. There were more villains in the building than they could count. Surely their teacher shouldn't be taking on this fight all by himself. No, absolutely not. 13 was very quick to deny them permission to fight. However, they were thinking about other options as well. They assured Aizawa that they would keep the students out of harm's way. And thus they were forced to only watch their teacher fight as a one-man army. It was impressive, to say the least. How could he go so long without blinking? Those goggles did well to keep his eyes protected. But nature's reaction to blink was a terrible weakness. The moment he lost his focus on the three and the monster in the back of the horde, one was gone. Where did the one in the classy clothes go? It was then that a looming aura became too powerful to ignore appeared behind the students. A thin cloud of dark fog rose above them, blocking the main exit of the building. 13 was quick to turn around and stand in front of the class protectively, keeping an arm up to keep them back. We're only here to steal All Might's last breath. Please do not interfere or we will be forced to put you through unimaginable pain, Kurogiri warned. Although a threat, it would be a greater risk in the future if one of the students died. He looked directly at Todoroki, seeing him stand defensively and a frost growing on his cheek. The one he's been taking care of with Midoriya standing before him like this, he hoped that he would forgive him. But the ones who appeared to be the angriest were Bakugo and Kirishima, glaring darkly and staring at each other from the corner of their eyes. Which one of you was it? Aizawa asked, stepping on the back of one of the criminals that he had restrained in his scarf beneath his feet. His eyes glowed red with his power, staring at Shigaraki and Midoriya on the Nomu. Which one of you three killed him? It was one of you, wasn't it? His voice had never sounded so cold and hateful. Which one? Which one killed his student? Midoriya and Shigaraki looked at each other and Midoriya only let out a childish giggle, making Aizawa's face twitch and snarl. It was you bastards that killed Kosuke, huh? Bakugo cried out, leaping forward with Kirishima, palms open and sparking up. They saw it before anyone. They were right in front of it. They smelt that corpse. They sat in its blood, paralyzed. They saw every maggot. They saw the dullness of the golden eyes. All the burns, the burnt insides, the melted jaw, they saw what pain Kosuke must have been through. The ones that caused that pain, the ones that displayed it so teasingly, the ones that had the nerve to come back and show their faces were here before them now. I'll fucking kill you for that. Bakugo let off a massive explosion directly at Kurogiri's eyes and Kirishima hardened his skin to be sharp and blade-like, swiping at what he thought would be the villain's torso. Both of them caused a cloud of dust and smoke to cover the area from their respected quirks. They missed. They attacked dead-on and yet they missed. When the dust settled, the group of students and 13 found themselves surrounded in a bubble of darkness. 13 still kept their arms up, seeing little that they could do in this situation. But they would still use themselves as a shield if need be. It would only prove to be pointless. While the darkness grew thick, only those that thought quickly could take a few out of the range of impact. When the darkness dispersed, it appeared that most of the students, except a few exceptions, were gone. Ida, Shoji, Siro, Sato, Ashido, Uraraka, and 13 had all escaped Kurogiri's warp, leaving the others to fend for themselves in the various areas inside the building. Aizawa could only look back and witness the uncertain fate of his students. So many had vanished in mere moments, but he had to trust that 13 would protect those who remained and that the others were strong enough to protect themselves. They were a promising bunch, powerful with bright futures ahead that only needed some guidance. Hopefully, he had given them enough to survive this attack. And it was a villain that almost hoped the same. Midoriya had also watched Kurogiri's work and saw that Todoroki was no longer on the cliff. He was the strongest of them all, surely he would be fine. Surely Kurogiri warped him to a safer area than the others. The little doctor only hoped that he could walk away from this without a scratch. At first, it appeared his wish would come true. Dropped in the landslide zone, Todoroki safely landed atop another hill, mud splashing underneath crisp white boots. He assumed himself to be alone and isolated from his classmates. He didn't see anyone else with him of a familiar face, though he was surrounded by some burly fellows with nasty facial expressions. Many of them were bigger than him, glaring sinisterly. To kill All Might, we're gonna have to bash a bunch of kids? What kind of job is this? He heard one of them grumble. All eyes were on him and there were a lot of eyes. We'll just have to make this quick then. One of them cracked their knuckles and neck with a wide grin. Todoroki's face remained stoic without an expression to be read. Rather, he appeared a bit more focused on the limp cameras that were partially hidden in the muddy zone behind rubble and rocks. They were shut down, but were they broken? This ain't the time to be spacing out, kid. A villain twice his size rushed him head-on. The moment his eyes focused off the camera and onto this violent stranger, the air became frigid. The soggy, muddy ground quickly froze over in moments. Before the villain could even land a punch, his feet were frozen solid to the ground. All of the villains were trapped in the ground as the mud had sunk them all in and made their feet too heavy to lift in time. But the ice did not stop at their ankles or their knees. One of them stuttered, shivering as his body was being engulfed. Aren't you embarrassed to lose to a child? Annoying. This was all simply annoying. His faith in heroes was depleting day by day. The hero training was becoming repetitive and he was losing interest. Now when true villains were before him, attacking him, they couldn't last even a few seconds in his presence. They were all bravado and intimidation with nothing to back it up. It was pathetic. People like this couldn't kill All Might even if they wanted to. It sucked to think that All Might didn't deserve to meet his end by such grunts, even after his heartless neglect of him. But everyone around him had become so annoying, almost unbearable to be around. All Might's false heroism, his friend's ignorant reaction to his emotions, his beloved's bully being loud and obnoxious, people mourning the death of a student who was nothing but cruel to him. And now these villains were underestimating him, mocking the power he had worked so hard to achieve. If only he could just make them all go away. For God's sake, you're adults. Put up a real fight. A stoic expression had slightly tensed in a suppressed anger. How frustrating. All of them. Everyone around him. Frost coated his cheek as ice crept up the bodies of every villain surrounding him, leaving them all paralyzed as it began to close in around their faces. A villain suddenly tried to ambush him from behind only for him to simply sidestep and grab the spear that was meant to hit him. He clutched it tightly, glaring at the one that made such a foolish attempt and froze the grunt while he was still in the air. He tore the spear from the nobody's frozen hands, making him fall pathetically to the ground as he tossed it away without a care. They were frustrating. If they could just go away, forever. They were just pawns anyway. At this rate, your cells will die slowly. There was a growing pain visible in the faces around them. He could tell that their bodies were growing numb. Hearing that they could die from the cold made their lips and eyes quiver. Todoroki's face showed no such mercy or care. He could kill them all where they stood frozen. A hero would never do something so cruel. But did he even want to be a hero anymore? The villain closest to him's eyes began to tear up. His fear became more intense as Todoroki raised his hand in front of his face with a threatening frosted air emitting from his palm. What's stopping me from killing you is a very thin whim. Tell me on what basis you plan to kill All Might. If he was caught killing on campus, there would be an outrage. But how tempting it was. To just make his frustrations disappear in a moment. The pawn easily revealed everything. They were being paid and bribed to be there with the promise of All Might's head, giving them unimaginable notoriety and infamy. Attention, money, a reputation. They were being promised worthless things and they were so easily swayed by them. Todoroki only shook his head as the other spoke, crying and wailing by the end of his explanation, begging not to die. The cameras are dead. Whose quirk is doing that? They were stuck in this building without a means of calling for help. But from what Midoriya had told him, he observes him every training period via cameras that were secretly placed everywhere. Maybe it would be possible to fix just one and send a message to Yamada for help. Teach, there's someone with an electric quirk. I don't know him or anything, but I think he has a pulse that cuts out a signal in the vicinity. Todoroki wandered away halfway into the man's conversation, causing him to raise the volume in his voice in a panic. If the ice wasn't melted soon, surely he would die or have serious damage done to his body. His life depended on a child's patience that was growing thinner and thinner. That child wandered to a bit of rubble nearby to two other villains that were also crying and quivering. He merely ignored them and picked up a camera that was completely limp. He inspected it, not knowing too much about electronics. The battery was fine, but it was flashing, no signal on the back. Do you know where the guy is? He asked, returning to his main interrogation subject. The Mountain Zone. The villain's lips were turning blue and shivering. There wasn't much time to lose. He had more questions to ask, but anyone could see how hard Aizawa was fighting in the center of the USJ. Help needed to come quickly. So he melted the ice down to the villain's knees, refusing to let them run free as he ran off to the mountain zone. Meanwhile, in a darkened building inside the USJ, two students were fighting side by side with fists and explosions alone, holding their ground impressively against villains at every corner. Blasting them against walls, Bakugo held back to the most refined extent to keep the building from collapsing. Kirishima was able to knock their attackers unconscious without much issue. But their exhaustion became more prevalent as their battle had gone on so long because of sheer numbers. When all had quieted down, they stopped for a breather back to back. Is that all of them? They're so weak, Bakugo commented, looking around at the array of unconscious grunts and craters in the walls and floor. All right, let's hurry up and save the others. Kirishima was not about to waste time. He kept the calmest demeanor that he could, but many things were revolving around in his mind at that moment. If we're here, then everyone else should be inside the USJ too. I'm worried about the guys with less offensive ability. Kosuke had great offensive ability. There was almost a cringe in his voice. Besides, because we ran off ahead, we slowed 13 down. If 13 had been able to suck up that fog, then this wouldn't have happened. As men, we have to take responsibility for what we did. Kirishima had turned to Bakugo, looking to him for agreement. He couldn't be the only one thinking this way. But the blonde turned away, eyes narrowed and dark. If you want to go, then go by yourself. I'm gonna kill that warp gate. A returned favor for their fallen classmate. Someone on the other side should die. What? You're gonna act childish at a time like this? Besides, that guy's attacks are be rational with these villains. The grunts were weak, but the ones at the center during the break-in were clearly the real threat. They could kill. They will kill. But Bakugo would not let that fear paralyze him again. Shut up. That gate bastard is the enemy's way in and out. I'm gonna cut off their gateway route for when the time comes. It's not like we don't have a way to fight the fog. They couldn't let them in again. They won't escape again. No one's being taken away ever again. Their conversation was almost cut off by a chameleon villain pouncing down from the ceiling in camouflage, but Bakugo acted far too quickly, taking the villain's face in his palm and pinning him to the floor before letting off an explosion calmly. Kirishima was surprised to see such composure coming from him. Anyway, if these small fry are the ones assigned to us, pretty much everyone will be fine, right? The chameleon twitched in his hand, unable to fight him back. These grunts were utterly pathetic. Despite all the confidence and wit, Kirishima noticed something odd in Bakugo. He appeared to be spacing out at that moment, looking down at the villain under his grasp and then glancing outside. The redhead had little doubt that he was acting this way as a means of payback for being caught paralyzed in fear the day of the bloody tragedy. He never wanted to be frozen like that again. The embarrassment he felt and the pride that he lost were so important to him. But this was also a day to try and get vengeance and justice for Kosuke. "Hey," Kirishima began. "We'll win this." Kosuke was alone that day. They took advantage of that. "But here, they're in our territory. We can fight them off together." He put his fist in his palm in front of his chest with a smirk. And then he chuckled. "Anyway, were you always so calm and rational? I thought you were more like Dash, a monster with no sense in social standards and endless desire to kill." "I'm always calm and rational, you spiky-haired punk," Bakugo snapped back. But then he began to make his way out. "Go if you want to." He wasn't going to force Kirishima to change his mind. Thankfully, he didn't have to. "Hey, believing in our friends. That's really manly, Bakugo. I'll follow you." In the mountain zone, there was screaming, though it came from a teenage boy running for his life. "I just saw the river Styx," Kaminari cried out, fleeing from villains much bigger than him. He ran to a rock wall and stood beside Jiraiya and Yaoyorozu. There was only so much he could do with his electric power being too uncontrollable around allies. But with one strong kick from Jiraiya sending him head-on into an enemy, she turned him into a human stun gun. "Huh, that actually worked. I'm pretty strong," Kaminari said, sounding impressed with himself. The villain completely collapsed from the shock, making him chuckle to himself. "You two should take this more seriously," Yaoyorozu suggested, holding a staff in front of herself. After that, the three were forced to defend themselves by using netting and weapons from Yaoyorozu, Jiraiya deafening the enemy with her speakers, and Kaminari pushing himself as far as he could go with his voltage. Eventually, as a last-ditch effort, Yaoyorozu made a 100mm thick sheet to cover both her and Jiraiya, although she lost a crucial piece of clothing in the process, leaving the smaller of the two with a massive blush of embarrassment. Using her quick thinking as an opportunity, with a bloody nose, Kaminari charged his body up as much as he could before letting out a wave of electricity in every direction. When all was said and done, all had become quiet outside the blanket except for a few stumbling footsteps. The two girls peeked out with Jiraiya clinging on tight to the other for the sake of decency. "Kaminari, don't you dare look," she demanded. But she and her words were being completely ignored as the blonde was walking around aimlessly with his thumbs up and drool coming from his mouth and blood from his nose. He shorted himself out. "He really is an idiot," Jiraiya sighed. While the earjack student tried to wrangle Kaminari, Yaoyorozu took the time to repair her costume. Unbeknownst to them all, not all the villains had been taken down. It was almost unfair with how many were in the mountain zone compared to everywhere else. From behind them, a hand shot up from below the ground. Many laid below the surface for protection. But one was down there to hide for as long as possible. But the students had proven that they were not forces that could be taken lightly and reinforcements were needed. It was then that there was a second ambush. So many came out of the ground in mere moments. Jiraiya lost her hold on Kaminari from the quaking. She almost fell backward when Yaoyorozu caught her. From behind. "You've got to be kidding," the shorter grumbled. She plugged her earphones into her legs once again in an attempt to deafen those climbing out before they could attack. Some fell victim, but many others were able to move out of the way from the directional blast. Yaoyorozu tried to create more darts and nets to immobilize as many as she could, but the nets were set aflame by a quirk and darts deflected with others. The second wave was much more capable of defending themselves, and the group of 3 students had lost a useful power. The loss of Kaminari's usefulness had become a problem. He was a walking target. He walked right up to a villain in a skull mask and spiky hair. He practically let himself be taken hostage. "Kaminari!" Jiraiya tried to at least get his attention, but the single brain cell he had working was not responsive. All she got was a slurred giggle as a hand was placed on his head by the villain. The 2 girls readied themselves for another battle despite already showing signs of exhaustion of their quirks. But as they prepared themselves, they found they had been surrounded and the villains were prepared to make a move quicker than they were. "I wouldn't try anything now. You 3 have done more than enough. And if you're really that stubborn, I hope that you're prepared to see your classmate die." The villain threatened with sparks coming out of his hand with Kaminari still in his grasp. "Kill him? Isn't that a bit extreme even for guys like you?" Jiraiya growled. Maybe she could just try to distract them all by talking. Isn't one dead classmate enough? We didn't want any of this. She slowly tried to sneak her earphones to her legs. She had to do it just slowly enough to not be suspicious. But so many eyes were on them. Yaoyorozu noticed her plan. They both raised their hands to show that they truly were defenseless. Why are you all here? If you're here for All Might, he's not here, she added to the plan. Or are you really after all of us? What was their real target? Were they with the mastermind or just mercenaries? It doesn't matter when you're just a bunch of kids in our way. And you, Jair suddenly cried out in pain as one of her ears began bleeding from something shooting just close enough to nick her. Don't think I can't see what you're doing. Caught. The quickly planned idea failed. Now, what could they possibly do? Sir Kaminari? He couldn't have the same fate as Kosuke. Not here. Not when he wasn't alone. Please, don't dash. None of them were close with the fire breather, but just the thought of another death, they couldn't bear it. The thought was overwhelming. Yaoyorozu shut her eyes and looked away, gritting her teeth. If they moved, then he would die. She couldn't bear that pressure. But to feel so helpless as a hero was shameful. But they had to protect each other. Staying together and strong together was all they could do. Kosuke died alone. But even though Kaminari wasn't alone, both of them weren't strong enough to protect him in his time of vulnerability. Pathetic. They felt so pathetic. So weak. How Midoriya would love to see them this way. But it was out of nowhere that a villain furthest to the back was frozen solid in an orb of ice and went flying towards the center, his body becoming a cannonball and knocking out a few in his path. A dust cloud rose from the landing, fogging up the area in moments. Ice? The one holding Kaminari shouted. Suddenly the air became thin and frigid, almost too cold to breathe in without one's throat hurting. The ground had frozen completely, though not as solidly as the landslide zone. But it was quick enough to immobilize the second wave of criminals that had surrounded the students. The one holding Kaminari jumped up with him still in his grasp, refusing to fall victim to such a simple attack. He leaped from the ground to the icy rock of an ally, and then to higher ground to watch the reinforcements being taken captive by ice. Where is this coming from? He questioned before he was hit in the back with a battering ram of ice. The force made him drop Kaminari, who simply made a little wage as he began to fall from the small cliff. Thankfully he was caught by a small safety net that was held by both Yaoyorozu and Jair. The villain fell sloppily to the ground but began to spark up as he got to his feet again. You're the one blocking signals. A voice muttered from behind him. A blast of electricity shot out from the villain, but it was blocked by a wall of ice that shot up from the ground. Todoroki glared at him from behind it and let ice quickly take its hold on him. Though he did not freeze him in a thick layer. Rather, he coated all of his body except for his head and physically took hold of his hand that was flexed for an attack. The ice trembled from an attempted attack, but the coating and the chill were too powerful. Another one, huh? The villain spat. I'm not telling you or helping you with anything, so get lost. He was stubborn. But Todoroki's face did not express patience. He was beyond frustrated. With the villain's wrist in his grasp, he began to force it to move despite being as stiff as stone. But like stone, it would be breakable. Amputatable. I'm not going to wait for answers if that's what you mean. Todoroki's expressionless face was unmoving as he made the threat to snap the villain's arm off. Ow, ow, ow. Stop. Are you trying to kill me? Was he trying to kill him? He almost killed his classmate. Surely he didn't expect mercy now. Todoroki made no effort to stop his force, even while the enemy began to cry for mercy. Todoroki stopped that. Yaoyorozu, on the other hand, was far more patient. She took hold of Todoroki's wrist and pulled off his grasp before he could snap the other's arm off. I know you're angry, but we can't do stuff like that. He blinked a few times, noticing that he had been grabbed and pried off. He was angry. He was willing to severely hurt someone due to this anger. But the people around him were always holding him back. After what he did, he almost killed Kaminari. He deserved it. He deserved it just like Kosuke did. We know, but he didn't. Calm down. His classmate shook his shoulder a little bit. He was slow to anger. But he was terribly violent deep down. What signal are you talking about? Yaoyorozu asked. Behind her, Gyre sat Kaminari down, tying up his wrists and ankles to keep him from wandering off and getting into more trouble. But the knots were loose so he could easily escape when his senses returned. Todoroki gestured to a camera that he had placed on the ground that was still flashing, no signal on it. We can't contact backup without a signal. I was told someone was over here blocking it. It must have been this guy. They needed to get the camera working again. In the not-so-distant distance, there was a loud roar that echoed through the USA. It was loud enough to pause the conversation completely and caused everyone to look up and try to see over the rocky barricades. It was a horrifying roar with the undertone of a shriek. Something was let loose. Stay here. Recover your strength and see if you can get that working. I'm going on ahead. Todoroki wasn't about to waste any time as he ran off without unfreezing anyone. Wait, don't go by yourself. Yaoyorozu tried to stop him, but her words weren't enough. But he was right, they needed to get the camera working. This battle couldn't be fought alone. Before the screech, there was still another fight taking place by the entrance. Kurogiri stood his ground by the door, forbidding anyone to escape and call for backup, unaware of an attempt being made elsewhere. It feels wrong for the class rep to run away while my friends are left behind fighting. A plan had been made, but it did not have Ida's approval yet. He had the fastest legs, he could make it back to the main building quicker than anyone, and he would be everyone's best bet. Quirks are meant to be used to help people. Even if you can't help directly, you have the ability to save everyone here. 13 did their best to explain to him that the act of getting reinforcements was not an act of cowardice. Trust us, we can hold our own. Ashido clenched her fists alongside Uraraka with a quivering smirk. Fearlessness was something fools had. Courage was something heroes had. Shiro, Sato, and Shoji all stood defensively, preparing to make an opening for Ida to flee. 13 raised their hand and glared directly at Kurogiri. You're just a bunch of fog. This is a bad quirk matchup, villain. They said rather confidently, opening up a portal in an attempt to suck him away. However, it was not that simple. Numbers had been on their side as well as firepower, but sheer technique was not so. With the use of a simple portal, Kurogiri was indeed partially sucked in by the black hole quirk, but it was merely a scratch to have it directed back at 13. The suction was powerful as ever, but it began to intake parts of them rather than the enemy. 13. Uraraka cried out, seeing their body be ripped apart by the pressure and power. Their own quirk being used against them with all its power, it was painful. 13 tried to close the black hole as quickly as possible, but the damage was done as half their body was ripped to shreds, leaving them to collapse on the ground and be tended to by Sato and Uraraka in a panic. It would be wise to simply stay put without a fuss, Kurogiri warned with eyes narrowed. The students stood paralyzed, unable to think of another way for Ida to escape. They were trapped. And soon a roaring shriek filled the area, piercing everyone's ears, causing Ida to look back at where their teacher was last seen fighting. Suddenly, escaping didn't seem like a priority. Aizawa had fought exhaustingly hard against the pawns that were set up in front of Shigaraki and Midoriya. His eyes were nearly bloodshot from how long he was going without blinking. His quirk was being pushed to his limit and he wasn't sure how long he could make it past that limit. His control over the binding cloth was his saving attribute, as he was able to restrain and manipulate the playing field by making his opponents jump pads and meet shields against each other. But he was able to make his way to the center, to the king of the chessboard he had worked so hard to reach. He was breathing heavily from the energy spent just trying to reach him, but he had more to spare when it came to his students' lives. Which one of you three killed him? It was one of you, wasn't it? He asked coldly, only receiving a giggle from Midoriya from behind a voice mixer and mask. He watched the littlest villain raise his black-gloved hands to his cheeks and stretched his fingers out with a tilt of his head. Talking about that fire breather and everyone else? That was me, he hummed, cupping the cheeks of his mask and giggling to himself. The most satisfying kill I've had yet. You should have heard him begging. He wished he hadn't. The stone-faced teacher broke into a hateful glare with teeth gritted and eyes brightly glowing redder than before. A nerve had been touched. It had been violated. These villains break down the door to his school, killing someone from his classroom, and then having the nerve to come here and laugh about it in front of his face. The binding cloth around his neck unwrapped from a grunt as he stared directly at the doctor sitting playfully on the Nomu's shoulder. "Don't laugh. Don't laugh at what you did like it was a joke," he growled. But before he could leap at the boy, Shigaraki had vanished and reappeared before him in a moment, attempting to lay a hand on him. "How cool! Fighting the famous Eraserhead up close," he teased. The two engaged in simple hand-to-hand combat that was not so simple. Both flexible, both fast, both with undying motivations to take down the other. What would make the biggest headline? Would killing a student get more attention or the teacher? What would lure All Might faster? They wouldn't let anyone escape and call for help, but Kurogiri could warp inside the school to find him and bring him here personally out of anger and irrationality. Who was the bigger threat? This scrawny man-child covered in severed hands or the masked boy on the monster's shoulder? Was there someone more powerful in hiding? Which one was calling the shots? Who was the mastermind of this plot? Who was the mastermind behind Kosuke's death? Were the two close or were they just lying for this occasion? He wouldn't let either take another life or hurt another child. That's at least what Aizawa was fighting his heart out for. But having a heart wasn't enough. Shigaraki was able to get a hand on Aizawa's shoulder as he slipped beside him, evading a kick and avoiding the scarf. The tired teacher was shocked seeing that the grab was not just a grab, but an attack. His shirt tore instantly and his skin began to chip away, revealing tissue and muscle that lied beneath. He kicked him away quickly and powerfully as an instinctive reaction, finally landing a solid hit on the villain. "Tamura!" Midoriya cried out, holding on tight to the Nomu. Aizawa took immediate notice of the reaction. They were close. That made them more dangerous. Shigaraki raised a hand to keep Midoriya back and keep the Nomu back still. "That kinda hurt, Eraserhead. But I'm not your final boss here and you're not mine," he hummed, getting his footing back. "You're a lot stronger than I thought though. You're so annoying." He looked around at the area and could hear battles going around all over the building. He could feel a chill in the air from a distance. Todoroki sure was powerful. If only he had that power now instead of fishing for it like they were. He began to scratch his neck thinking about how he may be taking down all the mercenaries he worked so hard to acquire. But that power just made him a more attractive party member. "So annoying. All Might's not here and I have to deal with you and all your brats." Shigaraki grumbled. But he didn't want to waste the Nomu's energy on such a grungy man. It would need all its strength for the symbol of peace. So the scrawny villain made another attempt at taking him on himself. He was faster than him, but not by much. And yet he was not stronger than him. The best he could do was graze him a few times with his hands, but it could only do so much until he was wrapped in cloth and pinned to the ground by Aizawa's foot on his chest. The man had never looked so pissed. "I better be more than annoying. I'd rather be your biggest threat." Aizawa pressed down hard on his chest. Midoriya tensed up and gritted his teeth behind the toothed mask. Shigaraki couldn't win like this as much as he would want to. His big brother was not strong in fights like this. "Tamura," the boy mumbled. To see him be treated like this, to be looked down on and taken down so easily, it frustrated him. No one should look at his big brother like that, no one was allowed to humiliate him. And yet Shigaraki was still smirking. "You made him mad. Like you don't have a choice, Eraserhead. You'll meet your final boss today and your end." Midoriya stood up on the Nomu's shoulder and pointed directly at Aizawa, hate filling his eyes behind that mask. Aizawa could never do anything for Todoroki. Todoroki wouldn't be mad, would he? "Kill him, Nomu. Don't let anyone stop you. Rip him apart," he demanded, filled with rage. The monster raised its hand to its shoulder, palm upwards. It let Midoriya onto its hand and lowered him down to the ground safely before raising its head, beak at a 90-degree angle. It let out a roar that shook the ground and had an undertoned shriek that severed the ears of everyone who was out in the open. The grunts that stood frozen twitched in fear. The students paused to look in the direction it came from. The real threat was awake and out for the blood of pro-hero Eraserhead. Aizawa glared at the noisy beast, taking his foot off Shigaraki but still keeping him restrained. He wasn't going to let him get away. But that wasn't his choice to make. Before he saw it move after its battle cry, it disappeared. Without a moment to think, he felt something slam into his back. It had been stronger than any quirk he had faced that day. It was stronger than all of them combined. He swore he heard his spine snap. He was sent like a ragdoll forwards just to see the monster reappear in front of him and bash him down into the ground, making a crater. His arms didn't feel right suddenly. Like both shoulders had been knocked out of joints. Before he could push himself up, he was grabbed by the hair and had his face smashed into the ground once. Twice. And a third time. His face and forehead were bleeding, blood coating parts of his face. This thing was barely trying. His head was too small for its palm to grasp properly. Shigaraki had gotten up, being freed from the cloth and being met with a hug from the little villain suddenly. "You're impatient," the taller one grumbled, patting Midoriya's head. But he had a wide smirk that breached the width of the hand on his face. Watching the man that landed a few hits on him be beat to a pulp. The sounds were disgustingly appalling. Bones were snapping with every hit, the sounds of a body being twisted in directions it was not meant to go in. It was something vile. But both villains took pleasure from it. This power belonged to them and their every command. Hey, I think I got it. Elsewhere, Jiraiya was fidgeting with the camera while Kaminari was on his side, still tied up and making weird little noises to himself. "Hello? Anyone there? Can you hear me?" She waved in front of the camera, flipping it back and forth to see if a signal was there. The villain that was frozen seemed dazed with his ears bleeding and some of his hair had been ripped out forcibly with some on the ground. It took some convincing for him to release his interference. And back on the main campus, students from the General Studies course noticed that the monitor reserved for Class 1A had turned on. Yamada turned to it thinking that the technical difficulties were finally resolved. But he was greeted with a more pressing matter. "I hope this is working because we're in some deep trouble right now. My name's Jiraiya Kyoka of Class 1A. We're at the USJ and villains broke in. It's getting pretty bad and a few people are hurt and dash." Yamada watched as the camera shook a bit in her hands and Yaoyorozu came into view with her. She looked panicked. "We need to get going. Mr. Aizawa is in big trouble." She tugged her and led her up a small hill where they could see a distant scene of the Nomu beating their defenseless teacher. Todoroki was just a short way down the hill, nearly paralyzed by the brutality in front of him. Oh shit. What is that thing?" Jiraiya stuttered, placing the camera down. A creature bulging with muscle was led on a rampage. Its bloodlust could be felt just by watching it. "We gotta help? Can we even fight that thing? Should they get close? If it was this dangerous against Aizawa, then it could kill one of them with even less effort." "Todoroki, don't go down there." Yaoyorozu shouted and reached a hand out as the camera showed their classmates sliding on his ice down to the scene as fast as possible. "Shochan." The clone of Midoriya cried out to the screen seeing him run towards the Nomu. Many of the students in the General Studies course were stunned by the scene and Jiraiya's message. Even the fake knew that Todoroki rushing down to the front lines was dangerous. Thankfully, it only took moments for Yamada to take hold of the closest phone in the room and make a call. The teacher was scared for the kids, but now someone even closer to him was dancing with death. This was no time to play things calm and formal. "We have a breach. It's them." An invisible clock was ticking. The Nomu continued its brutal torture, taking hold of Aizawa's arm and twisting to a painful degree and causing a gross snapping sound to fill the air. The teacher had done well to keep the sounds of pain internalized in grunts and groans. But it was then that he couldn't hold it back anymore. The scream of pain from such a reserved teacher sent shivers to those that could hear. However, even if he wasn't as strong, even if he was young and no match for this beast, Todoroki froze the ground around him, making a silent trail behind the Nomu and froze it to its shoulders and torso. "What?" Shigaraki commented, his smirk vanishing when he noticed the half-and-half teenager at the scene. Of course, the one they had to be the most careful of made it here. "Shochan," Midoriya said quietly, fear in his tone. "Don't get close. Don't see it's me. Don't get close to the Nomu." It was then Todoroki shot out another wall of ice, but not at the villains. Rather, making an odd shape, like a ramped wall to control a roller coaster or skateboard. "Ida," he shouted, watching his classmates sprint down the cliff from where he had been standing with his classmates and 13. This was no longer an escape mission. It was a rescue mission. "You think we're going to let you kill our teacher?" the speedy hero shouted, using Todoroki's ice curve to build speed and make a turn too quick for Kurogiri to catch him. The dark fog villain had tried to warp him, but could not catch up and keep him from interfering. Though, just as he got close, there was an explosion in the distance and one on the ground in front of him, making a blinding dust cloud. Next thing he knew, he felt someone grab onto his neck, his weak point, and pin him to the ground with sparking hands. "Don't move, or I'll blast up your ass so bad that they'll be piecing you back together for weeks." Bakugo snarled with a chaotic grin on his face. Finally, he had gotten a hold on this villain. "Oh, that doesn't sound very heroic," Kirishima commented, having risen from the ground after causing just the smallest distraction to allow the blonde to grab the villain. "Dad." Midoriya was about to make a run for Kurogiri when Shigaraki held him back. Ida had zoomed right past them while the Nomu shook trying to break free from the ice. It wasn't strong enough to hold it for longer than a few seconds, but it was just long enough for Ida to swipe Aizawa from underneath it and haul him onto his back. The man laid limply over him, barely able to keep his eyes open. "Get away from it," he muttered. It wasn't long after when the ice shattered from its body and it let out another roaring cry. The command was, "Don't let anyone stop you." The target had changed. Aizawa had to die. But so did Ida. Ida tried to make a quick getaway, but the Nomu was quicker. The class president turned a quick corner only to see the Nomu appear directly in front of him. It tried to take a swipe at him, making the hero skid trying to break and crouch down as low as possible. Another trail of ice formed at his feet to help him turn out of the way while also making an ice wall to take most of the impact of the Nomu's attack. Unfortunately, the pressure from it sent Ida off balance and sent him back, tumbling a few meters, but he made it so Aizawa never hit the ground. Pass him. Todoroki himself then slid by on his ice, nearly skating on it as he passed by his classmate and teacher quickly. He took Aizawa onto his back instead and tried to use agility against the beast, trying to get it to change its target. "We need to keep it away from Mr. Aizawa long enough for help to arrive. We gotta call out to the general studies course." Midoriya's heart dropped. His beloved hero was ultimately their biggest threat here. Quick-witted, courageous, agile, and strong, he had sent for heroic backup and was going toe-to-toe with his monstrous Nomu. And yet he was not angry. He wanted him to get away from it. Pass Aizawa off again. Let Ida take the damage. He couldn't just call off the command because then it would be obvious who he was. He just hoped Todoroki was quick enough. Todoroki turned on his ice in very jagged and unpredictable motions. The Nomu could catch up, but it wouldn't be able to angle and attack well enough to hit him. He continued these motions while passing Aizawa to Ida so he could regain stamina and keep the creature on a wild goose chase. But, of course, this could only last about a minute. Shigaraki and Midoriya only watched the students' desperate attempt to protect their teacher when an explosion went off from the cliffside. Kirishima was left with Kurogiri as Bakugo was too eager to be left out of the fray. "I dare you to try it. Try fighting it, Kaken." Midoriya growled with a smile under his mask. If there was anyone he dreamed of getting beaten to bits by his monster, it was Bakugo. But the blonde didn't go towards the monster. He flew right past it with the force from his hands. What? Why did he go past it? It was because he wasn't going after the Nomu. Shigaraki went to try and pull Midoriya out of the way, seeing that Bakugo's target was him. "You bastards need to get the hell out of here before I blast you all the way to hell," he screamed. His hand extended outward, sparking up for an attack against his old childhood friend behind the mask. He wasn't smiling. This wasn't fun. These villains deserved death. A massive dark hand wrapped around Bakugo's throat midair. The sparks were covered by its other hand to prevent an explosion. Above all commands, the Nomu's main purpose is to protect Midoriya. The little villain had recoiled in a flinching motion when he suddenly realized that he was not going to be hurt by Bakugo. Todoroki and Ida had frozen watching the monster suddenly change targets so quickly. It held Bakugo in its hand, its beak inches from his face, tongue, and teeth exposed. The boy struggled in its grasp, wriggling and trying to create explosions to fend it off. It didn't flinch. The explosions didn't scratch it. He was powerless against this monster. I'll fucking kill you, for what you did, you bastards, he choked, kicking his feet and pointlessly biting down on the Nomu's hand. The Nomu looked to Midoriya from the corner of its eye. Toss him. Like the garbage he is, he commanded, swiping his arm to the side. Bakugo was thrown with the force of a cannon. Through tree trunks, through forged buildings, through stone, his body left a crater in the wall of the mountain zone. He fell within a distance of Kaminari, who was just coming out of his idiotic trance. When Kaminari awoke, he found Bakugo bloodied and completely unconscious. Bakugo! Ida shouted, watching the dust settle from the path he was thrown. Midoriya did not have the chance to give another command before the Nomu was back to its original mission. A shadow loomed over Ida as he was suddenly kicked to the side against another rock wall where he too left a small crater from the force. The wind was completely knocked out of him and left him paralyzed for a short time as he tried to regain his awareness and strength to move. Todoroki watched this creature take down his classmates one by one before he tried to make a run for it with Aizawa still limply over his back and shoulders. Todoroki, you gotta dash! Aizawa tried to tell his student to flee for himself, but his lungs wouldn't let him talk as he was cut off from his own coughing. Save your strength or you'll die. Even though his life was on the line now, saving Aizawa was still his priority. Bakugo and Ida did not just get hurt for nothing. Bakugo may even be dead after such a hit. He didn't want to even consider that. However, Todoroki couldn't keep his strategy up by himself for much longer. He was growing tired. His muscles on his right side were becoming strained and exhausted. But he had to keep going, even if it was just a minute more. But he was slowing down. And that was his fatal mistake. No! Midoriya tried to shout, but it wasn't loud enough to be heard through the sound of the Nomu swiping at Todoroki so hard against a lone tree in the area. The wind was knocked out of him as he sat back against the tree that had broken in half from the force. Aizawa was dropped. The beast slowly stomped over to the teacher now that the three distracting it were out of the way. But one was just a little too stubborn and too rebellious to give up. Todoroki created a shell around Aizawa completely made of ice. The Nomu broke it with a punch. He remade another when it tried to grab the man. It broke it again. He made another. I'm not letting you kill anyone else, Todoroki muttered, glaring darkly at the monster. Don't let anyone get in your way. This boy was definitely in its way. Midoriya began to tremble as he watched his creature make its way over to his beloved. No Madu dash. Midoriya couldn't bear to watch. He was going to call off the command, even if he was risking his cover. But a blast of sound overpowered him and made his head pound. Jiro stopped down the hill but blasted her speakers directly at Shigaraki and Midoriya, making them both cover their ears and recoil. You idiots! I'm trying to save him, he cried out, but he couldn't be heard of Jiro's quirk. Todoroki! Hang on! Yaoyorozu sprinted down the hill and tried to fire a cannon she made at the beast. It hardly made a scratch as it shielded itself with its arms and was knocked back a few feet. Given this distraction, Todoroki struggled to get himself to move and get away. But he wasn't quick enough. Suddenly everything seemed so quiet when the Nomu bashed its fist into his ribs. The breaking of bones had been so quiet, yet so deafening. The wind was knocked out of his lungs as his mouth opened to scream, but not a sound came out. Aizawa watched in silent horror at the pained face on his student, seeing the Nomu's fist press past every rib, keeping Todoroki's body together. Ida raised his hand, crawling away from his wall in desperation. Todoroki, he gasped. The monster was going to kill him. Midoriya's heart shattered as he struggled to scream over Jiro's sound waves. Shouchin! Midoriya's body couldn't move against the pressure of the sound waves, he was too weak. His voice wasn't loud enough to reach his beast. He wasn't strong enough. He wasn't loud enough. He wasn't enough. Tears streamed from his eyes underneath his mask as he watched his beloved endure so much pain as every rib cracked and broke. Todoroki! But someone was quick enough. Kirishima came sprinting from behind the Nomu. It was a pointless attack. There was no way he could even dent the Nomu, and yet he put all his heart into his fist to punch the Nomu in the face. He leaped up to reach it and clung on to its back afterward. It took its fist back, covered in blood, and tried to grab the redhead that was just a bug on its back. But its arms were too bulged with muscle to reach. It struggled to grab him as Kirishima hardened his hair and face to keep head-butting it between its back shoulder blades. "Get up, dude! You gotta run!" he shouted. Todoroki still sat awake with his white shirt drenched in red and eyes half closed. In this state he still tried to move. His legs twitched as he tried to rise to his feet, but there was another snap from his torso when he tried to move his abdomen. His mouth opened to scream, but once again, there was no sound. He couldn't even stand. "Todoroki, you have to move!" Kirishima cried out again before he felt his foot get grabbed. The Nomu took him and tossed him aside without the level of force it had been using, seeing more as an annoyance than a threat. Yaoyorozu fired a cannonball at it again to keep it from going back to Todoroki and pushing it back once again. "Out of my way!" And it was Kaminari that came running up behind her, lugging Bakugo over his back when he dropped him off on the ground beside her and kept going himself. He fearlessly leaped at the Nomu's shin to cling on and zap with the most electricity he could manage without becoming dead weight. "Someone grab them!" he shouted out, stunning the Nomu for only a few moments. Tape wrapped around Aizawa from a distance as the ice around him had melted from the source of it being out of commission. Zero bounded Aizawa up and retracted him back to place him on Shoji's back in case they needed another quick getaway. Kirishima shot back up and made a dash towards Todoroki when he noticed something appearing behind his classmate. No. Wait. Kurogiri had been left unattended. Kirishima couldn't stay put and Bakugo couldn't keep his cool. A dark portal had begun to appear behind Todoroki just as Kaminari's electricity was running out. "Get out of there, he's behind you!" The redhead tried to warn, but he had become just a blur and a mesh of sound to the half-and-half boy. But he still tried to reach for him as he was being engulfed from behind. "Take my hand," he called out for him. Todoroki raised his hand weakly as he was being pulled back into darkness. Kirishima was only able to graze his fingertips as the other student was pulled back into the portal and it closed up before he could reach further. His heart fell to the pit of his stomach as he watched him get taken away. But he still had to move. He snatched Kaminari's hand and made a mad dash to get away before the Nomu could react. The entrance door blew out just as they did, causing a loud boom to get everyone's attention. Jairu even stopped her attack to see who had finally made an appearance. Shigaraki smiled. "He's here. I'll take good care of you, yeah? Just count on me," a cheery voice rang in the darkness. In a world of blurring purple and black, Todoroki was just barely able to see a mesh of light blue and tan. A person maybe. He couldn't tell. He couldn't breathe. He coughed up blood before he couldn't see anything anymore. When his eyes opened, things were quiet. He was under some trees, laying on the dirt. There were some bushes nearby. A forest zone maybe. He couldn't move, his breathing was hoarse. His torso ached and his chest felt like he was being stabbed. There was a piercing pain in his lower chest. Everything was still blurry and sound was still muffled in his ears. But he could still hear a voice. A different one than before. A deeper one. "Don't move. My apologies, but this is going to hurt." The voice sounded familiar, however. The same one that had threatened them at the beginning of the attack. He would try to make a motion to defend himself, but he suddenly felt an excruciating pain in his abdomen and heard shifting and cracking of bones from within him. He was able to gasp out choked cries, but they were still so quiet. He felt hands shifting his insides from the outside. "My son is kinda like a doctor. I used to help him study when he first started and I learned a thing or two. Your ribs are puncturing your lungs and air isn't passing to your brain." He was suffocating. This man, this villain, was shifting his bones away from his lungs. But it was painful. "I can't apologize enough for this unfortunate event. This was not supposed to turn out the way it did. We were only here for all might. None of you were meant to be hurt, just kept at a distance from the Nomu. Truly we are sorry." Todoroki felt his head be turned to the side as he began coughing up blood and gasping for air desperately. His hand gripped the grass tightly as Kurogiri stopped moving his bones around. "Please do not move or they may be shifted out of place again. Be extra careful." He then felt an oddly shaped hand be placed under his bangs on his forehead. It was cold. "Do you think you'll be all right here until your backup comes?" The boy didn't understand. This villain was being so kind and so gentle to him. He mentioned a son. He must have been a father. He felt like one. He talked like one. Would you like me to stay? Endeavor had never been like this. These villains almost killed him, but it sounded like an accident. This one was taking care of him now. It wasn't an easily forgivable mistake, but a feeling arose in his chest that was more painful than his lungs and ribs. Just a little while, he quietly breathed. Of course. All Might was not smiling when he arrived. Never had he looked so angry. He had outrun all of the teachers to make it to the USJ first. He looked to 13 who was being tended to by Ishido and Uraraka. Then he turned to Aizawa who was beaten and bloodied on Shoji's back with Shiro close beside him checking his breathing. You two had done more than enough, the pro sighed, lowering his head. He could see Bakugo in the dirt, Ida immobilized, and the others down there struggling to keep fighting although they had all paused with the Nomu to see him. Leave this to me now. I am here, he nearly spat, leaping down to the center where many of his students were around the Nomu. With the beast's attention on the symbol of peace, the students scattered, helping one another get as far away as possible, Yaoyorozu and Jiraiya helping Ida, and Kaminari and Kirishima helping Bakugo. Took you long enough. I was wondering if anyone was going to have to die before you showed up. Shigaraki said, folding his arms. All Might did not break a smile. There was nothing to smile about here. We've been waiting for you. And I thought you would never come. Midoriya growled darkly. Todoroki got hurt because it took him so long. How long ago had they called for backup and it still took him that long? I'll always be there for my students. I won't let you take another away from me. Justice will be brought to all of you, especially the one who had committed such a cruel act. Midoriya raised his hand. That would be me. But it appears you're already too late, big guy. Todoroki Shudo is already in our possession. Face it, you can't protect anyone. You're just lying to everyone and yourself. The little villain noticed All Might's expression twitch and fists clench tighter. Young Todoroki, he snarled. He could see Kirishima, Yaoyorozu, Jiraiya, Kaminari, and Ida turn away with a look of hopelessness in their eyes. They lost another one. Oh, never again. I won't let you escape with him. All Might's body flared up with steam, causing the Nomu to prepare a stance and roar a shriek at him in return. Kill him, Nomu! Destroy him! Midoriya shouted, making the Nomu scream louder. The superhuman and the monster fought hard, fist to fist. Had it been another world, another timeline with a successor to the quirk, All Might would be much weaker. But One for All was still his quirk, all of it. His body was growing weaker, but all his power still remained. The fight was one of brute strength and it first appeared to be an even match until the hero backup arrived at last. Yamada rushed to Aizawa without a second thought, guiding Shoji immediately to an ambulance where the beaten man could be tended to. We're here now. We're gonna get them, Yamada said to him on the stretcher, holding his hand while first responders did what they could to stabilize him right away. The kids, are they all there? Of course, he only had one thing on his mind. Yamada smiled just hearing ask such a selfless thing. He looked to Shoji with a quivering smile. Surely all the students were fine, right? Todoroki was taken, Shoji answered honestly, and the loud teacher's heart stopped. Endeavor's son. His students' beloved. Had he really been taken? They're still here. They haven't taken him yet. Yamada claimed confidently. He wasn't going to let one be taken. Not after Aizawa had fought so hard. Yamada wasted no time bolting back inside to assist the other pros. Grunts were taken down and apprehended with ease. Even with a handful of pros, they were no match for the strategy, experience, and power that they possessed. There's a missing student. Fan out and make sure they're all accounted for. Yamada shouted as loudly as he could without his quirk to make sure search parties were set up during their offensive. Students were retrieved from the squall zone and fire zone as others were inspected for criminals and students. Students that could manage stayed with large teams to stay accounted for but to also aid in their search. In a quiet corner of the USJ in a forest zone, Kurogiri still sat with Todoroki. Occasionally he would check his pulse and breathing patterns to see if his bones were shifting and if he wasn't internally bleeding, though he likely was. Oddly enough, he kept touching his head and face. He was just trying to keep him awake and calm. They were silent, with the only sound being the occasional breeze. Todoroki had weak eyes lazily locked on Kurogiri, unable to risk the strength to look away, though closed his eyes peacefully when his face was touched to show he was alive. It was blissful like this. He felt safe. But soon enough there was the sound of rustling and voices a small way away. "I can hear that your backup has arrived. Let them come to you, all right? Tell them I fled the moment they arrived and you covered yourself in ice to keep me away. They do not need to know our intentions," Kurogiri explained, slowly removing his hand from Todoroki's cheek. However, as he went to stand up, his hand was weakly grabbed. "You're kind," Todoroki wheezed quietly. "Thanks," and he let him go, letting the villain warp off. He was almost upset to see him go. "I think I saw something," Hagakure's voice cried out from a short distance away. Todoroki carefully rolled on his side and tried to raise his hand as high as he could. "I see someone." Ida's voice followed the gesture. Todoroki shut his eyes and lowered his hand, knowing that he had been found. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself to be fairly tall even though he was laying down. No, he was being carried. His head was up, resting against someone's chest. He could hear a strong heartbeat. "I'm sorry I yelled at you." "I'm so sorry, Todoroki. I'm so sorry I yelled." Someone was repeatedly apologizing to him. He could feel that his cheeks were a bit wet, but he wasn't the one who was crying. A dark blue mess was in front of him. Ida had picked him up bridal style and was leaning over him, quietly weeping. "I thought they took you away like Kosuke? But they didn't. To think that the last conversation we had was just me yelling at you. I'm so sorry." Todoroki tilted his head ever so slightly. He didn't get many apologies. He forced his bloodied sleeve down over his knuckles and used it to wipe Ida's glasses. "It's okay," he wheezed quietly. It hurt to talk. The class president raised his head and stared at him, taking full attention to the blood dripping out of his mouth. "We're gonna get you help, oh okay? Just hold on." Todoroki was still in bad shape, and Ida quickly raced to the front entrance without wasting another moment crying over a past mistake. Midoriya looked up at the ceiling in pure defeat, watching his precious pet be punched into oblivion by the #1 hero. He was so certain that it was strong enough to take All Might on. He was sure it could win. But it lost. They lost. This all had gone so horribly wrong. Todoroki was hurt, the Nomu was gone, Shigaraki was humiliated, and All Might still stood, a failure. This was all a complete failure. They could not have done a worse job here. "We need to get out of here." Shigaraki nudged Midoriya as heroes began running out of grunts to take down. All Might was on one knee, exhausted from his battle. They could escape at the very least. They could make another plan someday. They could make a better plan. Kurogiri appeared beside the two of them as just an essence of fog. "We must leave now. We have to hurry before twice quirk runs out." Midoriya had to get back to class. How could he hope to pretend that none of this ever happened? But more than anything, what about Show Dash? Todoroki will be okay. You must worry about him later. Kurogiri began to open a portal to return to the hideout. Suddenly, gunshots rang out and Midoriya felt himself be shoved. "Shigaraki dash." Kurogiri's voice raised, causing the little villain to look back and see his big brother had been shot multiple times. "You need to hurry up and change. And you need to warp him back. Get going before I get more pissed off." Shigaraki spat, as Midoriya turned to tug him back into the portal, his eyes brimming with tears behind his mask. I'm sorry, he repeated, dragging him inside while they were still being shot at. Looking back, he saw Ida holding a bloody and weak Todoroki to a group of pros. He hated how he was holding him so close. But much closer and in focus, All Might was glaring at them and weakly reaching out to them. "We'll get you. You can't run forever, you cowards." Midoriya turned away and heaved his brother back for the portal to close behind them. He had to be fast. But Shigaraki was hurt badly. Tomodachi, he insisted on helping him. They had both fallen on the floor, Shigaraki on his stomach and Midoriya on his knees beside him, prepared to try and drag him somewhere to tend to him. But the older villain slapped his hands away. "You need to go back before you get caught." Just listen to me, damn it. I'm the boss here. His tone was so sharp. He hadn't spoken to him like that before. He was mad. Of course, he was mad. Midoriya was too. But the little villain listened. He shut his eyes tight as he sprinted up the stairs to his room. He stripped, put on his school uniform, threw his masks against the wall and screamed in frustration. His face was damp with angry tears. He went to the bathroom to wash out the temporary black dye in his hair, clawing at his head aggressively, ripping some strands out. He stomped into his shoes and tied them tightly. His tears fell to the floors as he cried, tying the knots. Shochan, he had to go see Todoroki. He needed to see that he was safe, at least. Kurogiri had brought Shigaraki to the sofa and laid him on his back. Midoriya wiped his eyes as he came down the stairs, trying to compose himself for his return to school. Surely he'd be forgiven for being worked considering what had happened to Todoroki. I'll take care of him until you get back, the oldest villain assured. He calmly approached Midoriya to retie his tie. The little villain had done it so tightly and aggressively. He fixed it for him. It will be all right. You did your best. No, he didn't. He didn't do anything. He just stood there the whole time. He gritted his teeth and tried not to cry as a portal opened up. Midoriya found himself in a school bathroom with his clone standing right in front of him. Tough luck, huh? The fake asked. Shochan got really hurt. I heard they're taking him to Recovery Girl right away. You should go see him. Midoriya didn't say anything, just looking solemnly and emptily at his copy. You feel bad. But could you at least go see him for me? Midoriya scoffed at the request and folded his arms, looking away with a forced smile. What does he need us for? He has big strong four eyes. He was choked up as more tears slipped from his eyes. After all, I almost killed him. He was the one that hurt him. It was his fault. The Nomu was his. He hurt him like Endeavor did. He gripped his head and cried a bit harder thinking about it. I hurt him so bad. How can he ever forgive me? Because he loves you, the clone merely smiled at his original sobbing. You forget that a lot. So I remind you. You're the best he has and you love him better than anyone else. So go see him so you can keep being the best. The clone giggled and saluted him with 2 fingers and a smile. I'm trusting him to you again. Kiss him for me, will ya? Midoriya wiped his tears with his fists and nodded hastily. He turned on his heels, unable to watch his clone melt away. He burst through the door just as Shinso was about to walk in on him. He sprinted past him, not stopping to talk to him. He nearly slipped turning a corner in the hall because of how fast he was running. He ran and tripped up a flight of stairs, slamming his hands on the floor before getting up to run to Recovery Girl's office. Midoriya opened the door so hard it slammed back against the wall. He heaved and gasped for breath as he stood there, messy hair, damp and red-faced, hands shaking from adrenaline. In one bed was Bakugo wide awake and glaring at his hands as Kirishima sat next to him smiling. In another bed, Todoroki laid with his eyes resting and chest slowly rising and falling. Both boys in the beds were bandaged heavily, but Todoroki was more intensely wrapped at his abdomen and chest. Hearing the door open, one of his eyes peeked to see who had come in. Midoriya Izuku, you know better than to enter my office like that. Recovery Girl scolded her pupil. But he didn't care to listen to her. He stared at his beautiful wounded hero with his eyes still glistening from crying so much. Saying his name was so hard. He did that to him. His body was broken and in pain because of him. And yet, his beautiful boyfriend made just the slightest smile to him. I'm all right, he said quietly. The little villain broke one more time. He shut his eyes and ran right to Todoroki. He climbed onto his bedside and wrapped his arms around his neck and sobbed into the nook of his shoulder. Bakugo merely glanced over with narrowed eyes while Kirishima smiled with up-tilted brows. Todoroki placed a hand on the back of his little villain's head and leaned into him sleepily, running his fingers through his curls. That attack of the USJ, it was a terrible mistake. Bakugo's eyes appeared to flicker watching Midoriya break down into Todoroki. Watching him cry was normal. He cried all the time. But he watched something new appear in the eyes of his former childhood friend. How much darker they've become compared the mischievous glow they've been exposing more these days. Now they had gone darker than pine and evergreen, nearly black. And it was like they were almost swirling. "I'm all right," Todoroki mumbled sleepily, his hand in Midoriya's hair slowly falling. He was exhausted and breathing must have been so painful. Bakugo saw how his chest struggled to rise smoothly, the pain subtly being expressed by furrowed brows and gritted teeth. The Nomu had destroyed his chest and wrecked his lungs. Who knows how close it got to injuring his heart? "No, you're not all right." Midoriya brought his head up, cupping Todoroki's face carefully, leaning over him from beside him on the bed. "You're in pain. You're in a lot of pain." He was shaking. He had a trembling smile. He still had tears in his eyes. "Don't lie like that. You're not all right." He did this to his hero. Bakugo wanted Todoroki to open his tired eyes at that moment, wanting him to see the madness that had become obsessed with him and leave it in the dust. With how Midoriya was now, something about him didn't seem safe. Something in his gut told him to say something. He had been staring for so long with narrow eyes. Would it be more awkward to say something or nothing? "Don't lie to me. Don't pretend that it's okay." Midoriya's hands were becoming stressed, gripping his face tighter. Although it was subtle, the blonde bystander suddenly noticed Todoroki's face express a bit more pain. "Stop that. Can't you see that you're hurting him, you idiot?" Midoriya immediately let go with a silent gasp. His hands moved to his head and clutched it tight. He did it again. Without even thinking. "Give him some space, will ya? The guy just had his ribs crushed and he's hardly breathing. The hell's wrong with you?" Bakugo fearlessly scolded him. "Hey, I'm sure it was just an accident." Kirishima raised his hands slightly and spoke softly to relieve some of the tension and anger in the air. Surely, Midoriya didn't mean to be so rough. Accident or not, someone like him should know better to be more careful, the blonde growled, not breaking his gaze away from the little villain who glared right back. "And what do you know about being careful around people?" Midoriya snapped back, hands clutching the sheets and nearly baring his teeth. Bakugo knew nothing. He never understood anything about anyone. He only cared about himself. Sparks flickered in Bakugo's flexed hand as he forced a chaotic smile. "I know you're not safe to be around people, you freak." He sat up a bit more despite it clearly causing him a bit of pain. One eye closed and his body trembled from the exertion, but his attitude and morale were nowhere near as defeated. Midoriya, in turn, turned around on the bed and glanced at a rolling table with a few medicines, creams, and bandages on it. There was a pair of scissors that he grabbed with a shaking hand and quivering smile, eyes dark and swirling. A trigger-happy narcissist like you shouldn't be around people either. Midoriya was about to leap off the thin mattress and Bagwo would have done the same if it were not for interference. Todoroki weakly took hold of the lower rim of his little villain's shirt and Kirishima grabbed both of Bakugo's shoulders to hold him back. The two boys, overtaken by bitterness at the moment, paused and looked back at both of their impulse controls. Todoroki opened his scarless eye halfway as he breathed heavily, struggling to get a word out. He opened his mouth to talk but only managed to cough once and have a small amount of blood come up. "Not in here, man. And don't go picking fights while you're like this. We just got done fighting a bunch of bad guys." Kirishima held Bakugo back easily thanks to the blonde's weakened state. "Yeah, but we fucking missed one." But he still tried to fight back, ultimately being unable to overpower Rock in his state. He struggled only for a few seconds when he saw Midoriya drop the scissors and take a cloth to wipe Todoroki's chin and have him tilt his head forward, cloth to his mouth. "Cough it out. Don't swallow it," he said gently. And Todoroki did just that, coughing lightly into the fabric to stain it red. Afterward, the little villain pushed him to lay back before laying beside him, almost falling off over the edge, and petted his hair with his nose against his cheek. "Tell me when you need something. You can text. I'm not leaving. I have to help you get better. I'll take care of you. I'm gonna take care of you," he mindlessly began to mutter to himself, petting his hero's hair consistently, not taking his mad swirling eyes off of him. "He's fucking lost it," Bakugo grumbled, laying back and folding his arms, petty. More kisses were in store for Todoroki and Bakugo from Recovery Girl, trying to give them as much paced healing as possible before they would be brought home. Midoriya and Kirishima chose to stay as other students went home immediately due to the break-in. Authorities and heroes were all over the school, checking to see if anyone was lingering in the main building or anywhere else on campus, unbeknownst that their main culprit was sitting next to their boss's son. Bakugo's father came first as a hot mess with panic and worry. He reminded Midoriya of his mother. Ketsuki, my god, are you all right? He stumbled in and put one hand on the bed frame and one on Bakugo's shoulder, who just looked annoyed and frustrated. I'm fine, he grumbled. What do they know? Who the hell were those guys? And that monster? He still had his arms folded, his grip on his arm clenched tighter. Do we have names? Because I'm gonna kill them when I find them. Todoroki laid fast asleep, but Midoriya was wide awake. Having been kicked off the bed by Recovery Girl, he was forced to sit beside him, resting only his head on the mattress. But he was staring at the father and son across the room. You can't go after these people. But I talked to the hero Endeavor near the entrance. Endeavor had been very begrudging to give any details to the public because of how clever the villains have been lately. He knew he was being sent in circles. He knew each missing person was like a wild goose chase. Letting anyone know could send them even further from the truth. However, the desperation showed by Bakugo Masaru just minutes ago was enough to make him crack. The man had been a quaking mess, tearful and overwhelmed. He had gripped the pro's costume and looked up at him. Please. I need to know who are the people that are after my son's class. They've hurt him. What if they go after him next? Endeavor merely closed his eyes and shook his head, pushing the other off with no effort. Their sizes were not the only extreme difference between the two. I cannot reveal that information. Go about your day normally, citizen. We're doing what we can. His presence was hot with fire, but his aura was cold. Was there even passion left him? Masaru had gulped and took a few steps back, stunned for a moment. This man wasn't scary. No one was scarier than his wife. You have a son too, don't you? You have that comfort of knowing how to protect him better than anyone. I'm begging to at least have a name or a face. Help me protect my only son. Bagwo's blood-red eyes stared up at his father. He watched him take a deep breath. I beg of you not to pursue these people on your own, Katsuki. But the detectives were able to speak with your teacher for just a few moments. Midoriya watched them both from the opposite side of Todoroki's bed. He wondered if Aizawa would succumb to his wounds. Based on some footage and interrogations done on the villains captured, Bakugo snapped. I want to know the name of the one that killed Kosuke. He was getting impatient. It was the one with the mask. He's been dubbed the name Fallen. It's what the one with hands, Shigaraki, called him. Behind Todoroki, Midoriya's mouth went wide with a hidden grin, every tooth showing and his eyes brightly glowing green. His name was out there. He's made a name for himself. He was acknowledged. It's rather sickening. They believe he's been doing human experimentation. Katsuki, your mother and I can't let you go out alone for a while knowing someone like that is after you. That's lame. I can take care of myself. This is serious, please don't argue with me. Your mother thinks the same. To hell with that. This Fallen isn't going to fall to hell, I'm dragging him there. Bakugo's father held his forehead as he didn't know how to argue with his son over such a pressing matter. Surely he believed that teenagers deserve their privacy and should be trusted to go out as they please. But this was a matter of safety. For his life. Well, I wouldn't mind going with him if it'll make you feel better, mister, Kirishima spoke up with a smile. He flexed his arm and held his muscle proudly. Bakugo's super strong. He can do things himself, but Class 1A needs to keep an eye out for each other. It sucks, but I wouldn't mind doing a buddy system with him. Midoriya's smile had vanished as the conversation continued. But now he blinked, acknowledging Kirishima fully now. He had never really noticed him before, but he did spend an awful amount of time with Bakugo. He was there with him during the bloody tragedy. There during the interviews the next day. They attacked Kurogiri together and were warped together. They tried fighting the Nomu together. He should be treated as a true enemy. However, when Todoroki was being crushed, he released Kurogiri to save him. Todoroki would have died if it wasn't for him. Even though Kurogiri wasn't a threat to his beloved, Kirishima didn't know that and tried to rescue him. He looked miserable that he failed. And that was worth more than any bitterness Midoriya had against him for being with Bakugo. Oh, like hell. I don't need an escort. And yet the blonde was still stubborn. This is for me too, man. We gotta take care of each other now. Look what the monster did to you with one swing. Kirishima did have a point. It made Mr. Bakugo smile. I would greatly appreciate it, young man. Perhaps his son could finally make a real friend this way too. This is Bakugo was about to protest one more time when he looked towards the redhead who wasn't smiling anymore. He looked worried. It was a caring kind of worried. He wasn't looking down on him or calling him weak. These villains killed heroes and were targeting their class, likely for all might but maybe personal reasons now. Their strongest classmates and their teacher were put out of commission. Now was the time for cooperation, working together, and protecting each other. Fine. He gave in quietly. Great. Because I also totally need help studying for our next exam. Kirishima beamed. You played me? The red-headed student only laughed, glad to see his ego didn't take too much of a hit after all. The three had long left by the evening. Endeavor still had not come by to take Todoroki home yet, probably taking all the time he wanted and needed to inspect the school and the USJ. Midoriya hated how that was his first priority. He had half a mind to just take him back to the hideout right away. But he needed to tend to Shigaraki and his gunshot wounds first. Hopefully, Kurogiri was keeping him stable. For now, he leaned his head against Todoroki's and scrolled through mindless videos online. Todoroki was at least half awake, watching with him in silence. They just needed each other's company for their hearts to be at ease. Eventually, it wasn't Endeavor that arrived, it was Fuyumi. She was still dressed like a teacher with her tote bag over her shoulder and still in loud heels. They heard her running down the hall before seeing her come through the door, gasping for breath. Shudo. Fuyumi rushed to her little brother's side and put her hand on his forehead, watching his eyes focus on her rather than Midoriya's phone screen, but his exhaustion was obvious. I'm so sorry I couldn't come sooner. I got a phone call like 2 hours ago and I was still in class and there were no subs on duty and the kids and the police weren't letting anyone through and Dad, are you alright? She was rambling trying to find an excuse for herself but clearly she cared. Midoriya watched her carefully. She didn't seem like a bad person, rather a bystander. Someone who never goes out of their way for nothing. Todoroki raised his hand to place over his chest, feeling his own ragged breathing. Hurts to talk, he answered quietly. Fuyumi's face softened with sympathy and carefully placed her hand over his. I understand, let's get you home, yeah? She took her hand back and began gathering his things that had been brought to his bedside a long time ago. While she did so, Midoriya leaned close to his ear. I'll come get you as soon as I can, he whispered. He then watched as Todoroki expressed so much pain from simply trying to get off the bed. It took both Midoriya and Fuyumi to help him and he was forced to leave with a crutch in an attempt to keep himself upright. Midoriya felt his insides twisting at every grunt and sharp inhale he heard coming from his beloved hero, knowing full well that it was his fault he hurt. Would Endeavor be cruel enough to interact with him like this? Midoriya sprinted back to the bar, not even texting Kurogiri to pick him up when he was likely tending to Shigaraki. He could run. He's done nothing all day, so maybe he could at least make it back on his own. Maybe he could just do something on his own for once. Even when his legs began to hurt, he just kept running. When his chest and throat felt like they were on fire, he kept going. Shigaraki wouldn't have stopped to take a breath if the roles were reversed. Shigaraki deserved nothing but the best from him, and he was going to prove that his faith wasn't going to be in vain. Midoriya burst through the door and didn't even take the moment to kick his shoes off and instead went into the elevator to get directly to his lab. He passed Kurogiri, who was at the bar, fixing something to drink. Izug, hold a moment but the little villain didn't want to stop. Was Shigaraki stable, asleep, in pain? He had to know. But he had to prepare first. Once the double doors opened again, he rushed to his desk and cabinets, opening drawers and doors without closing them. He had always been so neat and tidy, able to calmly and precisely pick out what he would need to fulfill his needs. But here he had become frantic, grabbing anything that appeared to be useful at first glance. So many vials and bottles he had knocked over. Some even shattered, getting the tile floor dirty. Where? He muttered to himself madly. The little villain would suddenly feel 2 hands on his shoulders, making him jump and fumble a few things in his arms, and a couple of things fell. Looking behind him, he saw Kurogiri. He should have known. He could warp anywhere he wanted in the building. Hold on, he said quietly and began reaching for things in Midoriya's arms and placed them on the desk. He started separating them from things he needed and things that were unnecessary for him. I can do it myself. Midoriya tried to stop him, but his hands went right through the fog. He's stable, the bleeding has stopped for now. He has a bullet lodged in the back of his left shoulder and right thigh that I can't trust myself to retrieve. He's a bit agitated, so don't feel hurt if he snaps at you. Kurogiri explained, eventually taking a small box out of Midoriya's desk to fill it with things he actually needed. He has a right to, the little villain mumbled sullenly. Watching Kurogiri pack up his supplies like it was a bento box for school felt nice but so terrible at the same time. He lowered his head, not wanting to watch, and just stared down at his feet. Let him down. Midoriya tightened his eyes and gritted his teeth, letting the sadness and guilt overwhelm him. He had such high hopes for me and us together. I was useless. I dashed. He felt a pair of hollow arms wrap around him, a hand forcing his chin onto a shoulder. Without you, the Nomu would have been defeated much more quickly. It stood a chance thanks to your research. Shigaraki can have a secondary plan involving the Todoroki family because of you. He will be able to make a quicker recovery because of you. Do not forget the positives you've made. He would have failed with or without you. It was not because of you. Kurogiri reassured in a hushed and calming tone, making the little villain freeze up. The dark fog villain had got on one knee to embrace him in an attempt to restore his confidence that was desperately needed now more than ever. They needed to bounce back. But there was so much more weighing on him. He began to tear up and hugged him back tightly, nails digging into the back of his shirt. I hurt Shudo. The Nomu that was my responsibility hurt him so bad. How could he ever forgive me for that? Shigaraki doesn't have plan B anymore either. Kurogiri let him grip and cry if that's what was needed. Clearly, his babysitting style with Shigaraki was complicated and confusing. He had a feeling he didn't do what was best and failed the one that gave him a purpose now. Maybe he could do better with this freckled child. Todoroki will forgive you. For that you must trust me. Midoriya had seen Kurogiri warp Todoroki away from the Nomu, but he hadn't a clue that they interacted afterward. Did you talk to him? Was that a good idea? Midoriya asked quietly, still holding on. I did. You would know that he can be understanding when it comes to kindness. The little villain nodded with a smile, suddenly feeling a little better. He wouldn't ask what they talked about, using ignorance to keep himself from hinting himself away to Todoroki later. But his trust in Kurogiri was limitless. I think if you were just being yourself he would get attached to you too. It only took a father figure. Kurogiri became more thoughtful about the moment Todoroki asked him to stay by his side until someone arrived, even though he was supposed to be an enemy. It only took him being himself. But what was himself? Midoriya slowly let go and wiped his eyes with his sleeves before grabbing the box that had been packed on his desk. I'm going to help Toma now. Can we pick up Shochan when I'm done? I don't trust him like that with Endeavor. Kurogiri slightly bowed his head. Of course. With the confirmation, Midoriya went right to the elevator, leaving Kurogiri unintentionally to clean up the mess he made in his lab. He started by collecting shattered glass by a small puddle of a chemical when he swore he felt the temperature around him rise. In the corner of his eye, he believed that he saw a reflection of a person that wasn't him. But upon focusing, there was no one. He thought it strange, although he paid little mind due to other pressing matters. Tomu? Shigaraki's bedroom door creaked open as Midoriya gently pushed it open. He's never been in this room. It wasn't like he avoided it, but this was Shigaraki's private place and he hoped that he wasn't ruining it. The room was so dark with the only light coming from the white screen of a giant computer monitor. Occasionally it would flash, no signal, in a small black box. Midoriya tried to walk in further and nearly tripped over one of the many trash bags that were just lying around. Shigaraki was either a slob or just lazy with cleaning. No wonder he needed Kurogiri. Looking around a bit, he saw that his walls were cluttered with papers, newspaper cutouts, and pictures of heroes. Some words were highlighted and some pictures were XC'd out with markers. He had bookshelves that were cluttered with books and notebooks and even a few figurines of heroes and video game characters. His floor was hardly navigable with all the garbage above all else. There was only a thin, clean trail, likely made from Kurogiri coming in and out a few times that day. It led to the door and Shigaraki's twin-size bed, and in that twin-size bed was Shigaraki himself, laying on his back with clothes carefully placed over each bullet wound. He had one in each leg, the back of his shoulder, one grazing his side, and one in his left bicep. And yet he laid so peacefully with his eyes closed, his father's palm over his forehead, and breathing steadily. Midoriya felt his chest tighten and turn seeing him in this state. He caused this too. Shigaraki protected him from those bullets when they were escaping. He took every one of them. Tamura? I'm so sorry. Dull red eyes slowly opened, looking towards the emotional little villain. I've seen worse, Shigaraki grumbled, forcing himself to sit up. No. Don't move. Midoriya tried to keep him down, but the older one kept his hand up to keep him from interfering. It looked like he was in some pain, but nowhere near as much as Todoroki. He just looked tired from the blood loss. His body didn't have the nutrition to make this easier for him. He sat up and put his legs over the side of the bed and hunched over a bit. Kurogiri said most of them went straight through except two. You better be fucking careful, 'cause I'm not one of your dolls. He sounded untrusting, but he said it with a smirk. Sarcasm at a moment like this. Midoriya tried to hold his smile back, but he couldn't help but be happy that his big brother was still himself. He climbed up onto his bed and got on his knees behind him. Your room is so dark, it's hard to see, he said, using his phone as a flashlight to see the wound. You live like a raccoon, Shigaraki grumbled and rolled his eyes at the comment. Do not bite the blanket if this gets too painful. Don't clench your teeth, Midoriya warned, going through his box. Painkillers were blood thinners and he couldn't risk Shigaraki bleeding out any more than he already had. They'd have to do this manually and forcibly. The older villain merely closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He heard his shirt being cut into with scissors to keep the fabric out of the way. Midoriya knew him well enough that he wouldn't want to take his shirt off despite it being completely ruined already. The sound of a sanitized tool going into his wound was more painful than the feeling for him. He closed one eye and his body tensed up with a small exhale escaping his teeth, but he hardly flinched more than that. The little doctor almost found it disturbing. He was so quiet. He accepted the pain so willingly. Thankfully, it only took hardly any time to find the bullet lodged in the wound. Shigaraki didn't have a lot of meat to poke through to find it. I'm gonna stitch it now, okay? You doing alright? The older villain scoffed at the question. Fucking plus ultra? Midoriya smirked and put his face into the back of Shigaraki's good shoulder. He was so stupid sometimes. How was he like this after they just lost so much? His pride, his Nomu, his looming secrecy. They never killed All Might. How was he like this? Why was he being like this? Wasn't all this so painful? Really strong, Tomo. I wish. The little villain's smile was quivering. I wish I could be strong like you, no fear. No regret. No moment of weakness. Midoriya could only dream of being like that. Shigaraki didn't respond to him and closed his eyes peacefully, waiting for a needle to sting on his back. A minute later, his face scrunched from the sudden sharp pain of a needle flowing in and out of his skin. His movement was so limited, it was a mystery to how much pain he was actually taking in. When Midoriya finished his work on the first bullet wound, sanitizing and patching it accordingly, he moved to the floor and got on his knees beside his older brother's legs. Shigaraki moved forward so he could get to the back of his thigh where he felt him dig a tool into him once again after a hole in his pants was cut. The little doctor did not let curiosity distract him from his work and focused on finding the bullet rather than examining the other's face to see how he was reacting to the pain. A part of him was dreadfully curious. He examined others' pain as a means of research. He wondered how much pain tolerance his big brother had. Was it the same everywhere? What was his true weak point? But he had self-control for him. He was just a doctor now and nothing more. It took him just a bit longer to find the one in Shigaraki's leg before carefully removing it. The sounds of the muscle, tissue, and skin shifting didn't faze either of them. The hole in his leg was stitched swiftly before any bandaging was to be done. That was when Midoriya took his time Shigaraki's torso and limbs, wrapping them efficiently but not too heavily so he could still move more freely. He couldn't help but glance at the other's face and notice how tired he appeared. His silence was enough to show that he was upset. But what was he truly thinking about? Suddenly, there was a quiet beep from across the room that took all of Shigaraki's focus away. His head snapped up and his eyes displayed much more light, focus, and awareness. It made Midoriya jump and look to where he was facing. The screen on his computer was no longer white, but it was very dark with a blurry masked man displayed through a camera. Tubes were going into his mask where not even his eyes could be seen through it. Midoriya could assume that his face was best left unseen. Those tubes were for medical purposes. He wasn't healthy. Tamura. His voice was deep, but something about it sent a shiver up the little doctor's spine. The aura his very voice projected was enough to make him freeze. His skin was crawling. What was this man's power? Master. His big brother's master. In a different kind of way. His Todoroki. The look in his eye, the focus was intense. The affection. The intent behind his stare was not one of romantic obsession, but the desperate need to cling to him, and all his words was there. Do not fret this failure, Shigaraki Tamura. You can always try again, there is no reason to dwell on this. He was forgiving of him. Was he kind? The masked man every so slightly tilted his head. I see, presumably, the doctor you told me about. I nearly doubted him when you told me his age, but he appears to be skilled despite being so young. You've done well to find and train him, he praised. Midoriya lightly held onto Shigaraki's bandaged upper arm. We've lost the Nomu, but it was not destroyed. Shigaraki said honestly. We cannot so easily recreate one of that type. Most people's bodies could never handle that much power, but we can accommodate with others in the future if you need them. I trust they will be used effectively under your care. He was trusting. I regret misusing the first one. I could get it back. Midoriya regretted misusing the first one. But they both felt equally responsible. Don't waste your time. This was but your first attempt. You will have as many as you desire. For now, I want you to recover. Those wounds are serious and you require that rest. It would put me at ease knowing you are taking the time to heal, and I trust you will use it wisely. He was caring. Perhaps you could build a stronger, solid team to support you. Maybe put your doctor to better use. He does appear to have potential. You can manage those things while recovering, can't you? Shigaraki lowered his head, but his eyes were locked on the screen. There was fire in those red irises. Of course I can. There was a small scoff of approval from the masked man. Of course you can. I have the utmost faith in you. Now take care of yourself and prepare. He nodded and the signal was cut, leaving the screen white again. Shigaraki blinked slowly once the screen returned to its original state and looked up at the ceiling. Midoriya watched him react slowly but soon returned to bandaging him and taking special care of his side where a bullet grazed him rather deeply, but not enough for stitches. That was your master, huh? He seems, what was the best word to use? He knows best. He always seems to know what to do and what to say. Shigaraki came up with a description for him. And yes, that was him. Midoriya nodded in understanding before smiling softly. He's pretty special to you, huh? Shigaraki lightly scoffed with a smirk before nodding as well. Yeah, and the older villain would feel a head lean against his shoulder and someone clinging to his neck. He looked over at Midoriya to see what he was doing and turned out he was just hugging onto him. They were pretty special to each other too. I'm gonna go get Shochan. But come get me if you need me. It wouldn't take long at all for Kurogiri to transport Midoriya to the wall of the Todoroki mansion, but instead of climbing over, the little villain went near the front gate. Todoroki would be better off not using his ice or falling over the wall into a portal in his condition. Kurogiri held the freckled villain on his shoulders to see over the wall as a lookout. It would take much longer for Todoroki to exit his home as he used the front door this time. He didn't pack a bag and had Zuzu on a short leash tied to his crutch as he staggered out the door, exhausted from just getting through the mansion. He seemed a bit wobbly with his single object of support while trying to keep as straight-backed as possible. Unfortunately, he only made it halfway down the path to the front gate when he became unstable and Zuzu jumped up against his leg. Aizawa. Kurogiri tried to yell but kept his voice at a whisper to not be heard by anyone that could be around despite the area being mostly empty except for a few wandering cats. He saw Midoriya claw at the wall and clumsily climb over and leap from the top of it carelessly. Todoroki had remained in one spot, his legs nearly spasming trying to keep himself up. Before he could collapse, he felt another support rise up under his other arm and up against his chest as the freckled boy rushed to hold him up. Just a little further. I'll take care of you. He looked up at him, eyes clouded in subtle darkness that seemed to swirl in an unhinged stare. I'll make all the pain go away. Todoroki nodded tiredly. His breathing was heavy from what the little doctor could hear up close. His chest only hurt seeing him like this. He caused this, even if it was an accident. He helped him to the front gate with Zuzu slowly keeping pace to not take the crutch out from underneath her owner. Todoroki, meanwhile, closed his eyes and followed Midoriya's lead to the front gate. The air was still for a moment before he heard his feet walking on hardwood. We're back now, Midoriya said to Todoroki quietly after they were warped to the room Kurogiri had for the hero student. The wounded boy hastily kicked his shoes off and dropped the crutch. Zuzu escaped with her leash slipping off the crutch and scampered to and up on the bed where Todoroki followed with Midoriya's assistance. He laid down with a long sigh. Midoriya leaned down over him, placing his hand over the other's abdomen, sliding it around carefully. He watched little Zuzu nuzzle herself in the nook of Todoroki's neck as he appeared to be in exhausted distress. Recovery girl healed you, didn't she? Did Endeavor dash? Why was he still in so much pain? By God, if Endeavor was the cause, Midoriya's eyes had darkened swirls but flashed red at the thought. No, it's only when I move, Todoroki answered, raising his hand to rest in his dog's fur. The little puppy was quietly whining at him. Okay, Midoriya breathed. He felt himself shaking. He had become so anxious, out of control of his own movements. Shudo, I'm just gonna. He pinched the lower rim of Todoroki's shirt where he could get a peek at bandages underneath. He glanced back at his beloved's face and saw him clenching his jaw. He was just going to look? Midoriya lifted Todoroki's shirt to just above his chest and below his neck to expose his damaged torso. Bandages covered him so he couldn't get a proper look at his wounds. Give me a second. The little villain raised his hands before backing up and then running to the door. He had not even opened the door when he noticed the box of supplies was at the threshold at his feet. Kurogiri was always one step ahead of him. He picked it up and went back, taking out a scalpel and gulping. Looking down at his beloved hero like this, laid down in pain, practically immobilized and helpless, he looked just like a subject. He was so wounded. He was in so much distress. He was at his mercy. The doctor felt his heart in his throat all of a sudden. Was Todoroki in the same amount of pain as those that were on his table before? This was all the little villain's fault. One of Zuzu's whines came out a little louder than the rest, reclaiming Midoriya's attention. Not now. He wasn't a doctor at the testing table in the lab. He was his beloved's healer now. He took the blade and only used it to cut the bandages in half and remove them. Nothing more. He didn't even scratch him. There was a lot of discoloration. Deep purples, reds, and black were in small splotches around the center of Todoroki's torso. Midoriya softly put his hands on Todoroki's sides, gently applying pressure and watching him react with subtle twitches and silent small gasps. His skin was soft and smooth. He's seen him half undressed before, but never had he felt him like this. It got you bad, he whispered, eyes focused on every movement his beloved hero made. One little press of his thumb over a specific rib caused him to flinch with a muffled cry through his teeth. It was hurting him. Both of them. It's soreness. She's healed your wounds, but she can't push the healing process through an injury like this. Midoriya looked at him sadly. Shuto, did you ever see what happened to you? Todoroki had only watched Kurogiri's face when he felt him shifting his bones. He only saw his face and the sky through the glass of the ceiling. When Ida came for him, he only saw Ida's face and his tears. His blue hair blocked most of his view. Had he ever seen his own wounds? Midoriya was too far away when Ida carried him to safety, and the Nomu's massive size blocked him from seeing the injury right as it happened. Was there a single moment where he may have peeked? He shut his eyes to try and remember. Maybe for a second he looked. He looked down at his exposed abdomen and tried to think back to the moment he saw Kurogiri. There were bones sticking out. His costume was so bloody. But the Nomu punched him. A blunt force couldn't make him bleed, right? Some of my ribs, I think, came out. How awful he must have looked in front of Ida. No wonder he cried. How mangled he must have looked with bones jutting out of his body, blood-soaked and broken. Recovery girl fixed them and put them back into place, but he was going to be sore from so much trauma. The discoloration was not just bruising, they were puncture wounds but coming from the inside. Yeah, you're not gonna want to move. Just stay right here. Midoriya said softly, still keeping his hands on him. He hadn't noticed. His dull eyes were locked on every splotch on him that the Nomu caused. Just stay here, with me. His thumb gently ran over one of the discolorations. They would need some ice and some time. It would all go away. He could fix this. He looked to his beautiful hero's face, turned away with closed eyes and slightly upward tilted brows. With his shirt rolled up to his neck like this and an expression like that, Midoriya couldn't catch himself smiling twistedly slightly. He was in pain but so vulnerable to his hand. Almost like a subject. How cute. Cute? Midoriya took his hands back and pulled Todoroki's shirt back down. Why was he thinking like that? He couldn't be. Todoroki should never be looked at like he was on the testing table, nor should he be looked at so inappropriately. It wasn't cute. It couldn't be cute. He couldn't think of him like that. He dropped the smile and moved his hands to his hero's cheeks to angle his head up, where he gently placed a kiss on his forehead. I'll take care of you now. Midoriya stayed by his bedside for the day school was cancelled after the incident. Yamada stayed at Aizawa's. Shigaraki became glued to his computer. How long had he been working now? It was sometimes surreal that the laboratory didn't have windows. It was difficult to tell what time it was. The lab seemed so dark, the walls shrouded in shadows to make them look like a void. The light over the testing table was dim and flickering. Kurogiri would have to replace it eventually. It was distracting. Annoying. Midoriya worked quietly over a restrained subject, the darkness of the laboratory obscuring the face. Not like it mattered what they looked like. The little villain was focused on the insides where he had the stomach and lower chest split open. He was picking and poking around mindlessly, the skin around his eyes were darkened and bagged. Sleep wasn't something he was good at anymore lately, not ever since he started this secret occupation. He took more notes absent-mindedly, though it felt like empty scribbles. What was he even writing down? He spent a moment to squint at the paper. He couldn't be so tired that he couldn't read. It's too dark, he grumbled. He got on his toes and reached up to brighten the light over the table. He saw that the subject below him twitched in the restraints at the neck, chest, wrists, and ankles. Still alive down there? Midoriya said with a hint of surprise but mostly boredness. Must suck, he shrugged when he turned the knob on the light. The light got brighter, but it never dispelled any of the darkness, strangely. Maybe he was just going a bit mad down here. He probably needed to see more sunlight. The little doctor continued his work, leaning in close to the open incision to get the closest look he could with the naked eye. He used a gloved finger to move the skin, creating a liquidy squish sound. You've got some funny-looking veins, he commented casually, watching the subject twitch more aggressively. Stop moving. You're making it hard to focus. He stood back up straight to note more in his paperwork, though the words seemed even more blurry. He then took a small tool and leaned in close to the cut again with a scalpel in his other hand. The subject struggled once more. I said stop, so annoying. Why was he even down here? Didn't he have other things to do? Midoriya shook his head slightly, only for the subject to grunt and make a sudden twitch, causing blood to lightly squirt into the doctor's face. So annoying. I said stop, he snapped aggressively. The scalpel stabbed into the chest of the subject as they began to spasm violently. His hand instinctively went for the heart. The light still flickered above them both. Blood leaked out the stab wound, dripping down the side and onto the table. The subject grunted and growled as they moved violently with darkness obscuring their facial identity. "Just die so you can stop moving. You're such a pain," Midoriya shouted, watching them fight hopelessly. The light turned on and off repeatedly, blanketing them both in darkness over and over again. But in a moment of light, the face of the subject became clear. A crookedly smirked face, teeth exposed stretching ear to ear in a smile. It was only a second. The red and white split hair was unmistakable. But the golden eyes weren't his. "He's gonna die and it's all your fault." That voice wasn't his either. "Kosuke. Shuto." Midoriya's head shot up from the mattress, instantly putting his hands to his face. There wasn't blood on his face. He pulled them away to look at. There was no blood on his hands. He looked around at his surroundings. The Japanese-style room was so bright in the morning sun. This wasn't his room. He had fallen asleep on a stool at Todoroki's bedside. His head had been resting beside Todoroki's. He had to check. Without thinking, he forced his beautiful hero's shirt up below his neck and stared at his chest with sweat coming down beside his brow. There wasn't a knife wound. Faded discoloration around his ribs, but no blood. He had to be sure. He placed his ear down against his heart. There was a heartbeat. There was the most beautiful heartbeat. "Shuto," the little villain whispered, keeping his ear on his chest and looking at Todoroki's teary restful face. "Alive. Just fast asleep. Sleeping in. He deserved it." Midoriya reached for his hero's arm and ran his hand down to his wrist to caress so gently. His other hand was placed at the center of his chest, feeling him breathe and feeling no restraints. He wasn't on his table, not in the darkness. The little villain closed his eyes and took a deep breath, nearly matching his rhythm. They were in this lovely little room with the sunlight peeking in and its warmth cocooning them. It had been a few days since the USJ accident and those that were injured were still recovering and school was still cancelled, so another investigation could be done thoroughly. Midoriya had been caring for Todoroki's every need since he was brought to the hideout. His soreness had improved significantly to where breathing was no longer a concern and talking was less painful. Moving around was still kept limited and with assistance from his freckled healer. Midoriya had checked in on Shigaraki a few times to redress and check up on his wounds, but it was clear that he was going to need much longer to recover. He probably wouldn't be in fighting shape until after the sports festival in a few weeks. For now, Midoriya spent this early morning with his head on the bare chest of his beloved hero. He had fallen half asleep like that. His eyes had closed and he had nearly forgotten his position. What was on his mind was the nightmare he had just woken from. Todoroki had been on his table. He cut him open, picked at his insides, his blood was on his face and said such awful things. He would never talk to him like that. He never wanted to see him like that. But why was it Kosuke's voice and Kosuke's golden eyes? Why was he smiling when he should have been dying? Why was Todoroki smiling like that with a knife in his heart? He must have hurt him so badly. The freckled villain suddenly felt a hand on the side of his head, soothingly petting his hair side to side. He didn't think much of it at first. Instead, he even nuzzled further into the chest he was laying on, curling his fist beside his face in relaxed comfort. He appreciated the littlest divot in the center and the softness of the skin. Why were you crying? Midoriya hadn't even noticed that he was crying. But he recognized Todoroki's sleepy voice. Had he been more awake, he would have panicked in embarrassment. He had always felt ashamed looking, touching, and feeling at his hero's body, whether it was out of curiosity or a deeper desire that he had suppressed out of respect and decency. At this moment, he just wanted to hear his heart, feel his breathing, touch his near-flawless skin, and know that he was safe and alive. Knowing that Todoroki was awake, he slowly lifted his head and looked down at him with a soft, teary-eyed smile. "I'm just so happy to see you," he said heartfully, to which his beautiful hero reached up to wipe away a few tears from under his cut-scarred eye with his thumb and held his cheek. "I'm happy to see you too," he gently guided him forward to gently share a kiss. They parted only for the freckled villain to cup his hero's face and bring him a touch closer and kissed his scar on his forehead. Parting a second time, Midoriya's smile turned to one of awkwardness as he turned his head away and squirmed a bit in his stool. Sorry for just rolling up your shirt? Couldn't he just go one day without awkwardly looking or feeling at him? He made himself feel uncomfortable. Though Todoroki appeared unbothered as he rolled it back down without thinking much of it. Afterward, he did begin to look around curiously like he lost something. He propped himself up on his forearms carefully to not cause himself pain. Midoriya glanced about the room, wondering what he was searching for. For who? Did Zuzu get out? Todoroki asked, looking behind Midoriya, seeing the door to the hall cracked open enough for a puppy to sneak out. The freckled villain became stiff as he stared at the open door, dumbfounded. I may have gotten up in the middle of the night to get ice for your rib stash. He left the door open, like an idiot. I'll get her. He instantly got to his feet and hurried out the door, embarrassed over his second screw-up this morning. Did Shigaraki even know that Todoroki kept bringing a dog to the hideout? Quickly wandering out into the hall and shutting the door behind him, Midoriya looked back and forth between each end of the hall. Hopefully, Zuzu didn't get too far. The hideout wasn't that big, but it was run down. She would be small enough to find some kind of means of escape. She was usually so obedient, never leaving Todoroki's side unless it was an emergency. To leave him while he was sleeping was so unlike her. He went to one end of the hall to peek down the stairs to see if she could have made it to the bar below, but the door was closed at the bottom. He passed his own room and saw that the door to it was also closed. All of the doors were shut, except one. Shigaraki's door had been opened ever so slightly, enough for a dog to nudge its nose through. Oh, did Shigaraki even like dogs? What if she came up behind him and surprised him? He didn't wear gloves. Midoriya quietly approached his older brother's room and saw not a single light was on, as usual. He lived like a true hermit. The little villain poked the door open a bit wider to see that Shigaraki was at his computer with his back to him. He appeared to be reading a wall of text in silence, occasionally munching on a salty snack. Titomu? Midoriya took a step in, squinting his eyes to try and peer through the darkness. Maybe Zuzu was hiding in the trash. Maybe she just smelt food coming from the bags. Need something? Shigaraki asked back, not turning to look at him but lifting his head a bit from a slightly hunched-over position. He had such bad posture. But I was looking for ... The smaller villain was going to answer when the other turned around in his desk chair. He would have looked far more threatening if it weren't for the dog belly up and cradled in his arms almost like a baby. Zuzu had her head lolled back and tongue out, goofily looking at Midoriya while residing in the most threatening and dangerous seat in the world. How long had she been there? I didn't take you for a dog person. Midoriya stifled a giggle looking at his scary big brother holding a precious little puppy. Shigaraki looked down at Zuzu for her to look directly back up at him before lunging up with a surprise puppy kiss to the face. He closed his eyes in reaction but just let it happen. I wouldn't take your Prince Charming for one either, he muttered before looking up with a deadpan expression. Could you make him switch sides any quicker? Was he more focused on the dog or Todoroki now? Which one did he want more at this point? Midoriya snickered quietly to himself and folded his arms with a smirk. Depends what our next move is, boss. With the sports festival coming up and Todoroki still recovering, it was up in the air on what they could do to either go after All Might, Endeavor, or get a hold of 2 Todoroki children. As soon as he's healed, he needs to go home. Huh. Midoriya's snarky expression dropped. He wasn't expecting that answer. To send Todoroki away so bluntly was very unlike Shigaraki. I need you focused on your note-taking and you have exams coming up, don't you? Well, yeah, but ... And when he leaves, you need to tell me. You have to meet someone, so I want you in your costume right away. At least for the next month, you're to be focused on quirk experiments and training. Your Prince Charming will need to fend for himself for a little while. Is that a good idea? How am I supposed to bring him closer to us if I end up pushing him away? Midoriya became a bit nervous about this new plan. What was Shigaraki thinking? The key to getting the half-and-half boy to become a villain was his attachment to his freckled doctor. They've come so far that way. Why was he changing tactics now? He needs to think on his own. He has to want to be here himself, even without you. He can't be intellectually dependent on you. Midoriya's face twitched. Why not? He snapped for a moment before covering his mouth with his hand. He shouldn't yell like that, especially at his big brother. He expected him to be angry at his sudden tone, but instead, the villain in bandages smirked. I have my reasons. It was then that Zuzu wiggled a bit to roll herself over and stand up, doing some dog shakes before jumping off of Shigaraki's lap. She trotted towards Midoriya and went right past him. She didn't get far before she was scooped up by the little villain. He seemed a bit upset, sad even. You're not changing your mind, are you? He asked. Shigaraki wouldn't do that to him. After all this work, after all he's said, after all he's done for this, he couldn't be giving up on Todoroki. Quite the opposite. You're going to have to trust my logic here because it's not going to make a lot of sense to you. But no, I'm doing you a favor. He didn't see how keeping Todoroki away was a favor to him. However, alright, he did trust him. He can probably leave tonight. He wasn't looking forward to this. Returning to Todoroki's little apartment space, Midoriya brought Zuzu back to have her leap from his arms to her owner's bed. The little villain would follow her, sitting beside his beautiful hero and smiling softly to him. She must have heard my brother because she was with him. I guess he really likes dogs, he said, rocking back and forth slightly. I hope she didn't cause him trouble, Todoroki responded, bringing her to his lap and staring into her dark eyes as if expecting to see into her soul and become enlightened on all the sins she had committed. I think he actually appreciated her company. Though, the freckled boy looked away and out the window at some birds flying over the rooftops, riding the morning breeze. Outside looked so nice. I don't think he's trying to be rude. But I don't think he wants you coming over as often for a little while. It's nothing you did, honest. And I'm sure emergencies are the exception. But he wants me to focus on my studies and I bet he wants you to prepare for the sports festival. Would it really be okay to kick him out? Todoroki turned his head to face his partner and simply nodded. I understand. He seems like the responsible type. Midoriya mentally rolled his eyes. Sometimes he was responsible, but other times he was a bigger child than he was. You're not upset? He asked. Todoroki shook his head. No, I get it. I'll still see you at school after all. Midoriya spent the rest of the daylight with Todoroki. He had been very attentive the past few days, perhaps even too attentive. It appeared he had driven himself insane with trying to be reliable and caring to the hero he accidentally injured. But now his hero could sit up and walk on his own. Every so often he would need help getting to his feet. His recovery had been remarkable thanks to Recovery Girl and the constant care of his boyfriend. They'd spend the free hours watching videos online and watching TV together, side by side in bed with a puppy in between. During the afternoon, Midoriya continued to watch TV as he felt Todoroki take a nap on his shoulder. He petted Zuzu on his lap, but couldn't help himself to stare at his beautiful hero. Unfortunately, he watched his sleep get interrupted by his cell phone ringing. Todoroki's face scrunched in annoyed disturbance before opening his eyes and glaring at his phone that was beside the bed. He usually woke up sleepy and cute, but if he was disturbed, in his eyes was only homicide. He reached for the annoying device and saw that it was his sister's contact. Suddenly he didn't appear so angry. Fuyumi, she must be worried, he mumbled. Midoriya held Zuzu so he could talk without distraction when he put his phone to his ear. Hello. Shudo. Oh, thank goodness. Where are you? I texted you. I'm with a friend. Don't worry, he's taking care of me. Yes, I understand, but where? Midoriya and Todoroki both looked at each other. They both knew that wasn't something he was supposed to share or even know. Why? Do you need to can dash? Oh, give me that dash. Another voice was on the other side that wasn't Fuyumi's. No, Dad, don't yell at Dash, she must have gotten her phone snatched from her hand. Todoroki instinctively held the phone away from his ear and closed his eyes. The sheer force behind Endeavor's voice was so obnoxious. I did not approve of you leaving. It's been days, Shudo. This is so childish, you know better than this. Todoroki rolled his eyes and sighed. He didn't want to reply. How dead would he be if he hung up right now? Are you with that boy again? I swear if you are. So what if I am? Todoroki asked quietly, yet bitterly. Midoriya's arms were wrapped around Zuzu, but his hands were itching for his wrists. Was his hero going to be in trouble because of him now? Are you? Endeavor asked again, lowly. It's better than being there. But I'm coming home tonight, all right? Happy? He made the mistake of putting the phone to his ear again and immediately regretted it. No. This sneaking out has gone too far. Why is it so hard for you to stay put? He was hardly home anymore, of course. Endeavor was angry. This was the second incident at school where he had to leave early and he wasn't home to recover. The pro was under the assumption that Midoriya was tempting him, distracting him, and stealing him. He wasn't incorrect. Because you make the place feel like a prison. Of course, I don't want to be there. I don't want to be anywhere with you. Don't you see that? Todoroki snapped at that moment, shouting back over the phone. He was not afraid of his father. He refused to be. To be strong, he had to fight him. Don't you shout at your father like that, Shudo. Don't you see that boy is just dash. Todoroki hung up and tossed his phone across the room, not caring if it shattered or not. He watched his phone slide across the floor and stop, clenching his teeth in his anger. His blood was absolutely boiling. Then he heard Zuzu make a small whine. He blinked, snapping out of his anger quickly, and looked back behind him. Midoriya had his face buried in the back of Zuzu's neck with his nails deep in both his wrists. She was frantically licking at his left wrist, in particular, whining. She was very keen on sensing people's anxiety. Izuku, Todoroki mumbled, crawling over slowly to then start feeling for his face. One hand found his freckled cheek and felt it moist. He placed his forehead on the top of his head, putting his other arm around his shoulders. Izuku I'm sorry, the little villain whimpered. Was this why Shigaraki was trying to get him to stay home? Could he tell that it would get even worse between him and Endeavor even though that's what he wanted? Maybe he could tell it could get very dangerous. Midoriya realized how selfish he must have looked, risking Todoroki's safety by keeping him here so often when the threat wasn't that bad. Now it was really bad. No sorries, his hero whispered so soothingly. It's all right. Midoriya shot his head up, looking directly at his beloved just inches from his face. Scarred face to scarred teary face. No, it's not all right. Stop saying it's all right when it's not. It was all his fault. Stop lying. I don't like it when you lie. He clenched his teeth. Tell me when something's wrong, please. Did Todoroki not want to tell him when he was hurting anymore? That wasn't how he was at the middle school on that rainy day. It's not that something isn't wrong, Todoroki replied, moving his hand away from Midoriya's cheek to his left wrist. It's more like, I'm alive. And you're with me too. So it's all right. He guided the villain's wrist upward to see what Zuzu was licking at. No blood, but a deep puncture from his nails. That shouldn't be your standard, Midoriya mumbled. He then felt his wrist being kissed softly, multiple times. A guy with a lot of baggage and a big ugly burn on his face shouldn't be your standard, Todoroki retorted quietly, pressing his wrist into his right cheek to cool it. Don't say that, Shudo. You know I love everything about you. I just want you to be safe and happy. They both were speaking so quietly and gently. And that's why there should be no sorries. Todoroki was sent home that late evening with Kurogiri's assistance. Midoriya held both his hands and shared a kiss before he was warped away. He forced a warm smile, but the sadness in his eyes overpowered it. As soon as he was alone in the Japanese-style apartment, he took out his phone from his back pocket and texted Shigaraki. He let him know that Todoroki was gone. As he was told earlier, he went to his own apartment and began to change into his villain costume. Buttoning up his shirt, folding the collar, tying the tie, and slipping on his shoes, he looked at himself in the mirror. Last time he wore this, so many things went wrong. His tired face appeared so miserable in the reflection until he slapped his face with both hands. He was going to make sure that his next job would be a success. He smirked at the mirror and moved some hair covering his scarred eye behind his ear. The League of Villains was going to bounce back. He put both his masks on and went down to the bar. Shigaraki was on the same stool as he always was with his precious father on his face. So what's this about? Midoriya asked, coming through the door. His brother pointed to the sofa, wanting him to sit there rather than a bar stool. The little villain obliged. I've found you a teacher. I want you to meet him. A teacher? I've been roaming around some underground forums about him. He kinda has the same feelings you do towards heroes. About them being fakers and liars and all. Midoriya leaned forward in his seat. He's good with knives. Right up your alley, right? Before the freckled villain could ask any questions, Kurogiri's portal appeared in the center of the room. He saw a blood-stained black boot step out first before a lanky man wrapped in white and red cloths and black clothing followed it. He had quite the long, creepy face, mangled hair, and a hunched-over posture. He was splashed in blood and the sheaths on his back were dripping in blood near the top. He must have just killed someone. He looked around the room, glancing between Shigaraki and Midoriya and then examining the bar. Kurogiri's portal vanished and the dark Fog Dad himself appeared behind the bar. I didn't need your help getting out of there. But it was appreciated, the stranger grumbled. He had a bit of a scratchy deep voice. Hero killer, Stain. Shigaraki greeted, leaning back against the bar counter. It gained the man's attention. So you're the one that sent the bartender. Couldn't get me yourself? Shigaraki shrugged. You're hard to keep track of. But I'm not asking for a fight here, just a deal. Midoriya sat on the sofa with his hands between bent legs, childlike. Behind his mask was a look of awe seeing one of the most infamous serial killers standing before him. He could only wish for the same infamy, but he was rising fast on priority lists. To have this man as his teacher, he'd be the most feared teenage boy in history. But he wasn't very good at talking to adults, so he'd let Shigaraki do it. But was he really that much better? A deal with someone like you? I've seen you on the news about ambushing UA High School. That was a pretty lowly thing to do to a child. Stain said, speaking calmly, but Midoriya could see his eyes occasionally glancing around. He wasn't letting his guard down. They made eye contact at least once. There was far more to that. But I want to add you to my party. Shigaraki tried to brush it off. Party? Someone like Stain probably wasn't one for video games. What's your conviction? Think I'll team up with some random guy in a shady place like this? Midoriya could see him begin to draw a sword. He had such jagged blades. It's pretty simple. I hate heroes and I hate society. I want to destroy them all. But I'm not asking you to just kill them like a dog. I'll give you something in return. Shigaraki kept trying to negotiate, coming off as calm and simplistic. But his little doctor could see the serial killer's hand twitch. Bribery? The deal. Shigaraki still wanted to do this as professionally as he could. You're a guy living on the edge, right? Have any close calls with the heroes? Maybe there'll be a time where you can't get away. So, how about an apprentice? Someone to keep your influence relevant. Taken the wrong way, that could sound like an insult. It was like telling someone they were bound to fail. That sounds more like extra work. Your idea of a deal isn't very convincing. It's honestly getting on my nerves. And the hero killer wasn't pleased. Midoriya did not expect someone to be so fast. Stain had a large stature, but his swiftness and agility were beyond an impressive level. Midoriya watched Kurogiri's arm get sliced and bleed and his big brother pinned to the ground. It only took a moment. Such a terrifying speed. No matter what you want to accomplish, it is necessary to have conviction and desire. Those without it and those who are weak will be weeded out. He was about to stab his shoulder, the one that had already been shot. Seeing the blade gleam in the warm light of Kurogiri's bar was enough to trigger a speedy reaction from the little doctor that had been watching in silence. He won't let anyone talk down to his big brother like that again, not letting his pride get ruined once more. A little knife was no match for a serial killer's sword, but he had to try. Don't hurt my brother, he cried through a voice mixer, his body just moved on its own. He threw his tiny knife to knock Stain's sword off angle, making him stab the wooden floor rather than Shigaraki's shoulder. The action made the killer glance to him with glowing red hues, but a pair of the same caliber glared right back. Midoriya rushed him with another knife he had tucked in his costume. He had at least a few. Brother, huh? Stain muttered quietly to himself. Fallen, don't you dash. Shigaraki raised his hand to try and keep the little villain back. The blades clanged together when they met, and yet one force overpowered the other. Midoriya was pushed back and Stain got down to swipe him off his feet with a kick. The masked boy fell but rolled back before he could get stabbed. The sword went through one of the floorboards. This wasn't a man who played around, even with teenagers. He was on the same level as them after all. You don't get to talk to him like that. You don't know what he's been through. The little villain had been astounded by him the moment he saw him in the bar. He had heard of him before and thought very highly of his deeds of crippling and killing heroes. It was admirable. He wished he could be as skilled as him instead of Shigaraki and Kurogiri doing most of the work. Midoriya didn't have a chance to make the time to attack. When he got his footing, the serial killer was face to face with him with a dark look. He only had the reaction time to sidestep out of the way of his sword. He didn't expect his wrist to be grabbed. "Hey!" the little villain spat. "Take that off." Stain grumbled, using the hand he held his blade in to pull down the voice-mixing mask so he could hear his real voice. "I don't want you as a teacher. You might as well leave if you don't want to help. We'll kill those phony heroes without you." The hand on his wrist moved to his throat as he was lifted and pinned to a wall. His face mask was then ripped off, revealing soft freckled cheeks with a furious glare. Stain got a good look at him for a few moments. He could have killed him so quickly and easily. Shigaraki stood just inches behind Stain, a hand with 4 fingers placed on his shoulder. "We can have a talk about this, but cut him and you're gonna get the bad ending." "That's my little brother you got there, you know," he warned quietly. "He's just a kid." Stain noted, looking the little doctor up and down. He wasn't terribly short, but he was smaller than most boys his age. His face was less defined, giving him an almost baby-faced look. It caught the man off guard. "I may not have a grand conviction like you, but he does. But I don't think I can trust someone as crazy as you. You paralyzed my bartender." Shigaraki could have easily given up on the idea of working with Stain the hero killer. This man was a wild card, a risk to keep around. But he needed to give his little brother a teacher, and this was the best one for the job. People show their true colors when they're on the verge of death. This society is overgrown with fake heroes, where the word itself has lost its true meaning. And yet, Stain lowered his blade ever so subtly. "This boy knew that he couldn't compare to me. And yet he went to save you as a brother first, rather than a criminal ally." He glanced between Midoriya and Shigaraki. "You two aren't related." He began to lower Midoriya to let his feet touch the ground. "Let's talk about this deal." Midoriya sat on his stool next to Shigaraki, keeping his masks on the counter as he drank a glass of juice, watching Shigaraki talk with Stain on the other stool next to him. They both had small glasses of alcohol, fixed up Kurogiri. His wound was not as deep as it appeared, though he seemed annoyed by the blood stain. Under Shigaraki's word, he would not let his pettiness show. Occasionally Shigaraki would put his glass down without drinking all of it, gaining the mischievous attention of the little doctor. When he wasn't looking, he tried to reach for it only for the older villain to glance at him from the corner of his eye, smirk, and pick it up again. This left Midoriya with a small childish pout. Kurogiri was probably smiling through all the fog. Kurogiri thought back to how Midoriya blamed himself for the failure of USJ. If only he realized how much attention the League of Villains has received because of him. He's allowed them to pursue allying with the children of the number 2 hero. And perhaps had never engaged the hero killer when Shigaraki was in danger, a relationship between them would not have been formed. They weren't on the friendliest terms, but enough to converse casually at his bar and to consider a type of teamwork. Midoriya had done far more than he had realized. "It appears our goals diverge, but we do share an interest in destroying the present," Stain said, placing an empty glass down and looking at the 2 villains. They had been talking for quite some time, explaining themselves and their actions. Shigaraki didn't have much to share, but it was clear Midoriya had gained the serial killer's attention. Phony heroes. Liars. Arrogance and greed. They both had many shared ideals, only respecting people who acted selflessly. People like Todoroki. "And you want me to teach the boy how to fight despite him being quirkless? His determinedness to prove himself is admirable," Stain commented, moving his attention to the freckled boy. "I'm not trying to prove myself. I'm trying to save someone first," that freckled child corrected in a serious tone. "That kid I killed, he was trying to get a hero license even though he was hurting so many people. I couldn't let someone like that live." Not when he was hurting a real hero. I'm not senseless, I promise. Shigaraki and Stain had both listened to Midoriya speak. Shigaraki looked to Stain for a response. But he wanted to add a little more temptation. You've been doing your work for a long time. But if you ever need a place to lay low, he offered. The hero killer looked to the wood counter to think in silence for a few moments. Of all the things he planned to do and accomplish in his life, was he planning on becoming a mentor for a child who does human experimentation? It would have disgusted anyone to learn what he's done. But how much worse was it as someone who tortured heroes while crippling them? Maybe it was merciful that the little doctor killed them. He pitied the kid for being so involved in life like this. And yet he respected him. I'm not going easy on him. He's gonna get cut up, he smirked, resting his chin on his fist. We can figure something out. The sports festival was postponed. There was no way such a crucial event was going to be cancelled, thus it pushed in order to take proper security measures as well as providing the students of Class 1A to recover. Most were left uninjured but the few who had been badly wounded. The most notable was Aizawa, with major fractures and tissue damage. Thankfully no harm was done to his head. And the others were Todoroki, with severely and critically broken ribs and torn skin, muscle and tissue, and Bakugo who suffered quite a few broken bones. The public, the Hero Commission and the school were all very understanding of the action of postponing the festival. Though it was only for a week and classes were in session only a few days after the USJ incident. You sure you're good? Shoyuta, it's nothing to be ashamed of to stay Hodash. You really think All Might can teach them all day? He can only hold his form for 2 hours. Besides, it's my job to help them through times of uncertainty like this. Aizawa and Yamada sat in the car by the school, taking a few minutes to talk. Aizawa had been wrapped head to toe in bandages with his arm in a sling. He looked like a mummy. I get that. But we have staff that could sub in. Though, Yamada tried to convince him to stay home as softly as possible despite his attempts being turned down. You're too stubborn when things get like this. You must have been really worried for those kids, especially the ones who came to get you. He looked down at the steering wheel with a smile, though it looked pained. I know you feel guilty as hell that some of them got hurt. One of them almost got taken. Aizawa spoke sharply and coldly, but the bitterness was not being directed at his blonde partner. They both knew that. Todoroki could have died from those injuries. His voice quieted and his head lowered. He had been in and out of consciousness multiple times while Ida and Todoroki traded him off to each other to get distance from the Nomu. The memory was faint and dark, though he had a front row seat to see the monster pull its fist back from his troubled student. He heard every bone that snapped. He saw the jagged ends of those bones stab through the skin to make little bumps underneath his white hero costume. He saw the pure white of his clothes stain dark red, watching and listening to him struggle to move and run away. He would have been around the same age as Shirakumo, Zashi, he whispered. A little younger actually. Yamada turned to look at him as he spoke, seeing his thick shaggy hair cover most of his face. His wounds must have hurt him. But the thought of any more of his students dying hurt far more. They probably would have taken him too if Ida and Hagakure didn't find him as quickly as they did. And that thing would have finished Bakugo off if All Might didn't come in time. Aizawa continued. He was definitely pressed about the incident. Seeing him like that, Yamada couldn't help himself but to lean over and pull one of the bandages down from his mouth and gently kiss him to get him to stop talking. They all made it, he reminded him with a smile. And someone's gonna be Mr. Stubborn about it and go to work anyway. So I'm just gonna ask that you take care of yourself and don't push it. You did the best you could and they're all going to be in class as a reward, annoying the living hell out of you, he smirked. It at least made the tired hero scoff. They can't be worse than you. Yeah, I love you too. Despite not being able to spend time with Todoroki after school, it gave Midoriya even more reason to cling to him during it. Before class, he stood at the gate waiting for him just to see him walking by himself and visually unharmed. He wanted to hug him but instead only hugged his arm to avoid hurting anything that wasn't fully healed yet. You're walking like nothing happened. I'm so glad, he mused. Fuyumi called Recovery Girl last night. I'll be seeing her before training and she said she could clear away the bruising and the rest of the pain. Todoroki added softly, making the freckled villain hug his arm a bit tighter. He was so relieved. You'll be right back to normal? One result of his mistake was finally fixed. Midoriya got on his toes to kiss Todoroki's cheek, just down the hall from the Class 1A room. He didn't want him leaning over. Take it easy today, the little villain hummed, putting his hands on his hero's chest, resting his chin between them, looking up at him with loving green eyes. Lunch together today, just like always, okay? He asked. Todoroki nodded in confirmation. But Midoriya didn't get off of him right away and instead tilted his head to press his cheek into him, listening to his heartbeat and feeling his breathing. Even and smooth. Just like always, he suddenly blushed to realize what he was doing and backed off. They were at school, people could see them. How embarrassing. So I'll see you then, he smiled awkwardly, tugging his backpack straps and speed walked away, accidentally bumping his shoulder against someone as they were turning the corner. Oh, Todoroki. Someone familiar quietly gasped. The little villain looked from the corner of his eye to see who he had bumped into and who had called for his beloved hero. They flashed red at the sight of blue hair. The four-eyed prick. Midoriya didn't turn the corner and carry on his way, rather he turned the corner and peered back around it quietly to watch. He wasn't confident that he would be able to control himself if Ida laid a hand on Todoroki, or even if he looked at him too kindly. Ida approached Todoroki, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly and not making eye contact. He must have still felt bad about yelling at him still. They hadn't spoken to each other since that training exercise and Todoroki had a near panic attack. And now he stood with his back against the wall, looking up at the taller student. Neither of them were speaking, with one staring at the other, and the other staring off at the floor. Midoriya's eyes narrowed watching them. This was some cliché setup for romantic confession and he couldn't stand it. Todoroki Ida was about to finally talk when Todoroki accidentally cut him off. Thank you. It stunned the engine-legged student with a small silent gasp. For helping me get Mr. Aizawa to safety. And for finding me when that villain took me away. Todoroki subtly tilted his head to the side and took a deep breath, something he hadn't been able to do for the past few days. That could have ended pretty badly. Just like that time with the robot, you saved me again, so thank you. Hearing Todoroki thanking him was a little overwhelming. Ida gritted his teeth and shut his eyes. Midoriya could see his eyes beginning to water. You thanked me before I could apologize. He was a little upset that Todoroki had the heart to thank him before he had the courage and pride to say sorry. You don't have to dash. The half-and-half student heard him apologize while he was being carried and cradled. He hadn't forgotten. No, I do have to. I wasn't considerate of your feelings and boundaries during that training exercise. I reacted in anger and I felt that I triggered something that shouldn't have been touched. I should have been more understanding, so I'm sincerely sorry. Ida gritted teeth, bit his lip as he lowered his head. I never even checked on you afterward. I was too cowardly to talk to you again. And then you were the one that trusted me to assist you in retrieving our teacher. You worked with me even though you had every right to be angry or untrusting. And even after that, I wasn't strong enough to help you. If he had been able to dodge the Nomu's attack, he could have kept the pattern going long enough for All Might to arrive or to escape its range. Ida's legs began to quiver as he slowly got to his knees, causing a bit of shock to appear on Todoroki's face. When I saw you, your chest, your bones, all the bee blood, I thought you were dead. You could have very well died from those injuries. I'm responsible as your partner in that fight. He put his forehead to the floor and his palms on either side of himself. For that I am sorry, so sorry. Todoroki looked to both ends of the hall quickly, a bit nervously. He thought Ida was being a bit dramatic, though their class president was always a little extra. He got down on his knees calmly to get on a similar level to him, but he wouldn't lean over knowing it would hurt. I don't think all this is necessary, Ida. I'm not angry. Please get up. He wasn't used to this kind of apology and he was more awkward about it than anything. Really, I'm not mad. But I'll forgive you if that'll get you to stop. This is weird. There was a drop of sweat on the side of his head, but he was relieved when Ida raised his head. You are far too kind, Todoroki, he said softly, looking up at him slowly. Thank you. I see why Midoriya is very protective of you. Todoroki blushed ever so slightly at the comment. He nodded as they both went to get up. However, he was lost in the sudden thought of Midoriya being protective in front of Ida and didn't think about himself. He leaned over to put his hands on the ground and push himself up, which was a mistake. He recoiled, gritting his teeth with a sharp inhale. He hugged his torso and nearly lost balance. Todoroki. Away down the hall, Midoriya's nails dug into the wall, barely enough to make a small crack with his eyes glowing red with hate. Ida put his hand on Todoroki's side and another on his shoulder to keep him steady. Then his grasp fell from his side to his hip, holding him to lift him back to his feet without him leaning over. "You haven't recovered yet, have you?" Ida asked, holding him steady. He wasn't sure if he would collapse if he let go, though it was likely he'd be fine. This made the peering villain around the corner furious. Recovery Girl and Izuku did the best they could. "I'm fine as long as I'm careful. I'm just sore." Todoroki slowly released himself with a sigh, but Ida wasn't so sure. He appeared to be spacing out for a moment, even subtly flexing his grip on his classmate's hip. He was more toned and curved than he thought. But Ida just looked so sad. "Ida? Oh, sorry." Ida took his hands back and put them behind his back. Todoroki sighed and adjusted his bag over his shoulder before patting Ida's shoulder once and walked to the classroom door. "Todoroki dashed," the class president said suddenly, turning to him before he could go through the threshold. The scarred student put his hand on the door frame and looked back, showing that he had his attention. "I just thought I should Ida stumbled over his words a bit. "You should know that I think Midoriya is incredibly lucky." Todoroki blinked a few times before nodding, thinking he understood, but in reality he was clueless. Midoriya was quirkless, that didn't seem very lucky at all. And the boy on his mind had begun to bite into the wall to keep himself from losing all self-control. When the two students went into the classroom, Midoriya was left unable to stalk them anymore. He went to turn around and make his way to his own class, but he stopped when he saw Yamada quickly kiss Aizawa's lips by moving a bandage out of the way. "Don't push it, Kay," he said cheerfully, letting the bandaged hero carry on his way. Though he noticed Midoriya and blushed to realize he was caught red-handed. Aizawa looked between the two. How he would love to interrogate the freckled boy, but the hallway and in front of Yamada was not the place nor the time. He trusted his happy-go-lucky teacher to handle it and know what to say. He had his own work to do and his own students to speak to. "So are you and Eraser?" Midoriya began, walking beside his teacher, both on their way to homeroom. "Well, kinda but not really," Yamada answered. The freckled students had been picking up vibes between the two pros for a while now. He made it a point not to make assumptions, but now it was becoming a little too obvious. "You two live together, don't you?" Another voice asked from behind them. Someone else had seen them as well. Turning around, both Midoriya and Yamada saw a student with messy purple hair and tired eyes. The loud teacher looked up at the ceiling helplessly. Caught by two of his students now, at least they were his favorites. He could at least trust them to keep this on the down low. It wasn't against the rules to be in a relationship with another staff member. It was just something he wasn't sure parents would be comfortable with. Kids were a bit more open-minded these days. So then Shinso, Midoriya, and Yamada walked together with the little villain in the middle. "How would you know, Shinso?" Midoriya asked curiously. "They drove me home once. They take the same car, so I kinda thought they lived together or something." Yamada ran his hand through his vertical hair and sighed. "Well, yeah, very insightful, Shinso," he complimented awkwardly, proud but also embarrassed. "So are you married?" the two teenagers asked simultaneously. Such innocent eyes were on him, staring so curiously. He hated to burst their bubble. "Not necessarily," he answered. "Engaged?" Midoriya leaned in a bit closer. "Just dating?" Shinso held a finger to his chin and looked off in intense thought. "No, and I don't think so." His next answer just made them more confused. They looked to each other, not quite sure what kind of relationship was left. Relationships don't really need labels, kiddos. Sometimes you feel best just being with someone at your own pace and for your own reasons. There's a commitment, but it's less stressful when there's no solid label. The purple and green-haired students listened carefully, nodding in unison to show their focus. Then they looked at each other again and then pointed at him. Friends with benefits? They shared a single brain cell. No. Yamada shouted in minor frustration, though it was more comical than serious. Aren't you too young to know what that is? He then sighed and rubbed his temple with his thumb and index finger. Anyway, we're just us. And we like it like that. At least he does. His voice got abnormally quiet at the last sentence. Shinso and Midoriya tilted their heads with sympathetic looks on their faces. They could tell something wasn't completely perfect. I shouldn't have said that, it's not a big deal. He smiled and waved his hands in front of him, but his two students stepped closer to him as the three of them came to a halt. He was in too deep now. Oh, don't look at me like that. Really, I'm just being dramatic. Yeah. He shot them both finger guns with a big smile and dramatic pose, but they weren't buying it for a second. Mr. Aizawa doesn't want a serious relationship, but you do, Midoriya stated, feeling a bit bad for him. Yamada twitched and stayed frozen in his pose for a few moments. Read like a book from a teenager. He dropped the act and rubbed the side of his neck. There was a bad accident a long time ago. When we were in high school. I think it's deterred him from ever wanting something serious, so I don't push it. Knowing where the boundaries are and understanding each other are the most important parts of a relationship besides communication. And if he's happy, then I'm happy. He sounded a bit saddened at the beginning of his explanation, but by the end, he was smiling again. Now go on, you two. Time for homeroom. He got behind Shinso and Midoriya and gave their backs a good shove into the classroom. School had become a place of normality for the little villain. Todoroki was thankfully safe at home with Endeavor focused on the sudden disappearances case. They knew the aliases and the kind of people he was looking for, but their location and motives were still a mystery. There wasn't a need for Todoroki to have an emergency overnight stay with the villains. Disappearances kept happening, which kept the number 2 hero busy. The little villain he was desperately searching for and trying to understand was training every day tirelessly, balancing schoolwork, experiment work, and now combat training. It's the busiest he's ever been. But never had he felt more alive. And yet Endeavor's staff had never felt so exhausted to death, having been worked to the bone for ridiculous hours. Hey, Midoriya. Midoriya had been doodling in his notebook pictures of Ida's face and then scribbling them out or crudely graffitied them when Shinso sat in the desk in front of him and turned around to face him. I've been keeping track of everything on the news and poking around online everything about the sudden disappearances case. He held up a journal. I don't want to give you more homework, but do you think we could hang out after school so I can get your opinion on it? It had been almost 3 weeks since the USJ incident and the sudden disappearances case was still making headlines. A rookie hero had gone missing last week and people were just as nervous as ever. Shinso was still betting on a traitor. He was persistent, but he was right. They've talked about it fairly often in homeroom and when going to the viewing room, but Midoriya spent most of his mornings with Todoroki rather than homeroom. Actually, Midoriya hummed, holding his pen to his lip. He wasn't supposed to spend time with Todoroki out of school under Shigaraki's order. It almost felt like cheating on him to go out with Shinso. But if this was a way to get closer and get another member for the League of Villains, it could be important. My tutor is out on business today, so I think I actually have time. Sure, he smiled sweetly. Stain had business in Hosu this week, so he had the free time to spare. So that late afternoon the two left school together with Midoriya sending a quick text to Shigaraki explaining that he'd be back late that night. Shinso took the little villain to the side of the entrance gate where he had his bike locked to a bike rack. You bike to school? Midoriya asked, watching him get on one knee to unlock his bike. Yeah, my parents don't give me money for a train or a bus and I don't have a job. And it's a bit far of a walk. He rolled it back and began walking with it alongside his classmate. Why don't they give you money? It's not that expensive. Midoriya didn't take him for the impoverished type. They don't like talking to me. So they just kinda don't? Don't what? Anything. Midoriya could put a few dots together. It was neglect out of fear, but also bitterness. His parents were likely paranoid of being controlled by the tired boy's quirk. They didn't trust him. They didn't want to risk speaking to him by accident, so they ignored him completely so they wouldn't feel the need to converse with him. They probably pretended like they didn't even have a son. Mr. Aizawa and Mr. Yamada must have driven you home after the tragedy then. Midoriya deducted. Shinso nodded. Sometimes Mr. Yamada will stop me on a rainy day and put my bike in the back of his car. He invited me to dinner once and was pretty insistent on it. The two of them really do have a strange relationship. Midoriya tilted his head. How so? Shinso recalled the time he was invited over for dinner on a rainy day, his bike in the trunk of the car with rope tying the trunk down to keep it from falling out. He never expected such a goofy and wild hero to be such a great cook. He had been doing homework at a kotatsu with a cat perched on his shoulder and one playing with the pages in his textbook when he saw Aizawa come out of the master bedroom without bandages. Parts of him were badly bruised and his arm was still in a sling. Most notably, he had a dark scar on his cheek. When he was home, it was probably a good idea to let his wounds breathe without the pressure of bandages. Careful, that one eats paper, he warned, walking by with a small flask. What was in that flask was anyone's guess. Could be water, could be vodka, could be vinegar. Shinso had been busy trying to guess when he slightly jumped at the sound of a small tear and saw the cat trying to eat the corner of the textbook page. Hey, no dashed, he reached to take it in his arms and away from the book. Aizawa just smirked at him and continued to the kitchen. Yamada had been chopping vegetables at a cutting board when the tired hero leaned back against the counter, taking a small sip from his flask. Feeling all right? The blonde one asked cheerfully. He got a nod and a quiet, "Good," he smiled. Always so positive. Always so hardworking. Putting his best into everything and doing his best for everyone. One could maybe see Aizawa blush while watching him cook happily, just satisfied with him being his cheery self. After about a minute of silence, Aizawa leaned his head on his shoulder with a tired, quiet grunt. He stayed like this until he heard the chopping stop. "How come you didn't come to bed last night?" he asked after a few minutes when Yamada moved to put the chopped vegetables in a pan on the stove. The blonde looked back. "I woke up in the middle of the night. You weren't there." Did Aizawa wake up from a nightmare or was he just having trouble sleeping? Either was a good assumption. "Oh, I was just working late again." "No big deal." Yamada's face and mood were bright and shining. But Aizawa could see the slightest hints of tiredness under his eyes. "Endeavor's work?" he pressed. Yamada was stirring around vegetables in the pan, so he didn't make eye contact to answer. He wasn't trying to be rude, he just didn't want to burn their dinner, especially with Shinso as a guest. "Yeah," Yamada answered. Aizawa looked down at the floor and to the side. He looked a bit angry. But Yamada was smiling with his back turned to him and his tone was still positive. "By the way, I forgot to mention. I'm putting my radio podcast on hold for a while." He didn't see Aizawa's eyes snap open wide and quickly look at him. But she was cut off accidentally. "After what happened to you and those kids, finding those villains is far more important than my silly show. I'll start it up again as soon as this is all over. So it's all good." The bright hero turned back with a big cheesy smile. And yet his tired partner looked a bit upset. "Hisashi, but you love your show?" He genuinely looked worried and even heartbroken for him. When Yamada went back to focusing on cooking, the eraser hero walked up behind him and wrapped his good arm around his waist and moved his sling to at least rest against the other's chest. He pressed his unharmed cheek against the back of his lower neck. Endeavor was overwhelming his partner with work, forcing him to give up one of his hobbies just to be able to get enough time to sleep at night. Being a hero takes sacrifices. "I'd rather drop the show and lose some ratings rather than risk almost losing you again. You can definitely tell they're close. And they're really casual. But you can tell something's holding Mr. Aizawa back." Shinso explained as he and Midoriya stood at a crosswalk waiting for traffic to pass. Midoriya couldn't imagine himself living like that with Todoroki. He'd probably end up begging for unconditional romantic love. He felt bad for his teacher. The freckled boy would miss his podcasts. Shinso led Midoriya to a typical fast food joint that was definitely not copyrighted whatsoever with big gold arches and had an infamous work ethic history. Midoriya took the liberty to pay for food for Shinso despite his protest. They sat down together and the freckled villain looked over the other's journal. Shinso had been taking notes and coming up with theories and questions for weeks. There was a ton to go through. "Does your eye ever hurt?" Shinso asked after eating for a couple of minutes. Midoriya was deep in thought when he looked up and blinked a few times. He pointed to his own scar that Kosuke left him. Oh, this little thing? Nah, not really, he brushed it off. Must be kinda haunting to be scarred by a kid that was murdered. The little villain could never forget him every time he looked in a mirror. It's a little weird, yeah? It was sudden when Midoriya's attention was taken away. He had been looking at Shinso when he noticed a group of boys out the window behind him. Blonde hair, red hair, black hair, and bleach blonde hair. He recognized them immediately. Kaminari, Kirishima, Shiro, and Bakugo. This was the closest fast food place to the school, so it wasn't too random to see them. But to see Bakugo with them, he was surprised. He saw the three others talking and then burst into laughter with Kirishima wrapping his arm around Grumpy One's shoulder. You know them? Shinso asked, looking back and noticing what the freckled villain was gazing at. One of them. I would rather forget him. Midoriya huffed bitterly. He continued to look through the journal, leaving Shinso to play on his phone. He had a flip phone. His parents must have never given him an updated one. The squad of boys all sat down with their food and they were a little rowdy, but no more than a normal group. After a few minutes, the purple-haired boy just had the slightest feeling that he was being watched. He tried to ignore it for quite some time, but it was really bothering him. It was like people staring, making rumors about him, making fun of him, calling him a villain or a creep or something. He couldn't bear it any longer and looked back to immediately see the one with a lightning bolt in his hair look away awkwardly. Though it wasn't shame or fear he was expressing. It was an embarrassed blush. Shinso blinked once before going back to his phone and instead tried to listen carefully. He had learned to block voices out, so he was afraid of what he could hear. Really, dude? You're such a creep sometimes. Yeah, but you're bad at it. You're so obvious, man. I don't know what you're talking about. Did they think he was funny to watch? What kind of rumors had they heard about him? You know, I think I just learned Kaminari's type. You don't know my type dash. Purple. Two of them broke out in laughter while Bakugo ate silently and grumpily while Kaminari blushed bright red. In a nervous reaction, he snatched Shiro's fries and began eating them as quickly as possible. Hey, those are mine, you jerk. Shiro tried stealing them back, making Kaminari whine. You don't get to call me out like that without repercussions. You know Jiru's got eyes for Yammo. I don't stand a chance. Kirishima just pointed to him as the electric student kept wolfing down fries. You're just a raging bisexual man. Shinsu's face had turned red hearing what was going on a few feet away. Was he mishearing this? He had to be. He totally had the wrong idea. Don't you guys remember that one time, when Todoroki got into that fight with Kosuke? He calmed him down like it was nothing. That was like so cool. And he did it looking all stoic and badass and Kaminari put his head on the table, having eaten all of Shiro's fries out of revenge and was just a mess of emotions. Why people gotta be so pretty, guys? It ain't fair. Midoriya looked up from the journal to see Shinso covering his mouth and staring blankly at his phone, face red at the cheeks. He had been listening to the squad of boys too and could easily tell what was happening here. He only smirked. Sounds like someone likes you, he mused. I shouldn't be making friends. I need to focus on rising higher than the general studies course. Shinso put his fists on the table, trying to get himself to focus. He had a goal. Respect and recognition before friends. Well, you were friends, right? Midoriya tilted his head with a smile. Between being saved by Kosuke, colluding to find the UA traitor, investigating their teacher's private life, and giving each other moral support, that's what friends do, right? There was an explosion outside just as Shinso tried to answer. It was big enough to shake the building and blanket the street in dust and smoke. It gained all of the teenagers' attention as people began running from the opposite direction that it came from. Shinso and Midoriya looked outside and then to each other. They were in hero school, or at least one was pretending to be. Midoriya slid him the journal as the other put it in his bag. They put their bags together to leave inside the restaurant and made a run for it outside. The squad of hero students followed right after them. Guys, we shouldn't. We can't use our quirks in public. We don't even have our costumes. Shiro shouted as a warning. They weren't supposed to do anything. But they could find a way to help somehow. The sound they all recognized was fireworks. Was it just an accident? People were running from the source, coughing from the smoke. In the distance, there was the sound of a woman laughing, car horns, and crashing. That's definitely a villain, Shinso stated. Some of the smoke had cleared just down the road where a woman with long dark gray hair and a mask stood proudly with a bulky man who had a growth and strength quirk that made him bigger and stronger than a normal person. His skin looked as hard as rock, and the road had been cracked with fissures and sharp dikes stabbing out of the ground. That's a terrain-controlling quirk like Cementos, Midoriya pointed out. Both students noticed a small group of people being held in a cage of dikes, sharp rocks jutting out of the ground for the tips to meet at the top and being close enough together for people being unable to escape. A hostage situation. Let's get as many people out of here as we can before a hero shows up to fix this, Kirishima suggested to his little squad. The group nodded and strategically split up, including Bakugo despite looking pissed off. The second using his quirk would be considered self-defense. He was going to use it, though he ran right past Midoriya, glaring at him darkly with bright red eyes. He wasn't going to help that quirkless freak get away. He knew that the little villain wouldn't stand a chance against villains. A few people were hiding behind cars and rubble in fear. Many were covering their ears. Let's see how much money you're all worth as hostages, the woman announced proudly from atop a dike, her arms folded and then opened dramatically. She ripped out a strand of hair, ripping it in half and having both halves turn stiff and straight. She tossed them like needles at a building only for them to light up like a fuse. When the fuse burnt the hairs out, they exploded into fireworks, creating more smoke and causing glass from the building to shatter. People screamed in fear of the attack. So how much are the heroes willing to pay, huh? She whipped her arm to gesture to the buffer, bigger villain who then slammed his fists down and made the ground shake. Dikes spiked up and stabbed through cars, revealing people hiding in fear and setting car alarms off. I can only control one person at a time. I might faint if I try both, Shinso said. He and Midoriya had hidden behind one of the dikes together. The big guy doesn't look like a talker either. So I'll take him, Midoriya stated, reaching into his school blazer for something. What? Aren't you Dash? Shinso watched the freckled villain take out black gloves with little metal clawed fingertips. My tutor's a pretty cool guy. Time to see if I'm a lost cause or not. These were the hot thing back when I was in high school. But they were extremely difficult to control, so people with quirks just never used them. Midoriya had taken the pair of gloves from Stain during the start of their training together. He put them on and flexed his fingers in them. Am I supposed to be a cat now? He tapped the claws together and suddenly clear wire shot out of the metal finger pads and got all over him and quickly tangled up. He didn't move to prevent getting immobilized and looking like an idiot. Stain picked up the end of one of the wires and held it between two fingers. People with quirks good enough to be heroes don't typically use stuff like this. I can't think of anyone who ever became a pro with them. Which makes them perfect for you, Stain stated. Midoriya tried to examine the wire and realized how strong it was. He tried to snap it, but it stayed strong. Try focusing all your energy and attention to your fingertips. The little villain nodded and closed his eyes. He wondered what someone quirkless like him could do with hero costume devices. Did he need a quirk for these to work? What were they made of? Where did Stain get them? What if they didn't work for him like everyone else? By the time he opened his eyes, all the wires were standing straight up and touching the ceiling, defying all gravity. He looked up and became fascinated with science-defying material and device he was using. You've met Eraserhead at the USJ. Remember that scarf he uses? These are the same things, except there are 10 and the fibers are thinner, so they're harder to make more precise. The little villain's eyes were sparkling with awe. Heroes trained for months to use these kinds of weapons. We're going to see how long it takes you, someone who doesn't have a quirk taking on your priorities. That and teaching you how to really move in battle. The student glanced between his gloved hands and his teacher before getting a bright minty glow of mischief in his eyes. Understood, Master Akaguro. It was illegal to use quirks in public without a license. But there was nothing against abandoned support weapons. Midoriya put on his gloves, giving one a good tug with his teeth with a smirk and a wink at Shinso. Let's show those hero course boys how it's done. His glowing eyes desired nothing more than a little bit of fun. He kicked off his first step by wall jumping from dike to dike, leaping off of them a rabbit or even a frog. He had gained quite the amount of muscle in his legs. Shinso was shocked to see such speed and agility. The claws on his gloves gave him extra grip on the rock, being able to dig into them and keep his balance. A kid? Are you serious? The female villain shouted, annoyed. She ripped off pieces of her hair and hurled them at him, sending fireworks his way. The boy only smiled and broke off a piece of rock and tossed it at one hair to smother one firework, letting only one go off. He bounced off the dike he was on and went to land on another. Master Akaguro, huh? Shigaraki had asked in the training room late at night. Most of the lights were turned off, giving it a low warm light. Midoriya had been at the center of the room, balancing on a thin pole with one foot with eyes closed and intense focus. He was in a black tank top and shorts, revealing more muscle than he's ever had before. It wasn't as much as Todoroki's, but it was enough to be impressive for someone his age. He was no longer a starving villain. He had all the motivation to become stronger and healthier. Stain and Shigaraki were standing together with the skinny villain leaning against the wall, watching him. I knew you'd like him, Shigaraki smirked under the hand on his face. Stain folded his arms and scoffed, looking away. He's an impressive student. He improved more than anyone I've ever seen, he grumbled. They watched the freckled boy continue to balance himself, practicing on focusing his energy and attention. Part of his agility training was in balance. I'm grateful he'll be able to protect himself from now on. I wouldn't be able to forever. It's a lot of stress off my back. Shigaraki sighed. How relieving. Stained looked at the skinny villain from the corner of his eye and then looked at his little student. His desire to save that boy is admirable and his conviction against fake heroes is as well. Had he not chosen this life, I imagine he would have the potential to become a truly amazing hero. Shigaraki shrugged at Stain's theory. Too bad that society turned its back on him. It's all they're good for. The serial killer nodded in agreement with Shigaraki. Maybe they were a little more on the same page than he originally thought. He went to look at Shigaraki when he froze. When had he taken the hand off his face? He was shocked to see how his face really looked, scarred and dried out, but red eyes illuminated in the dim warm light staring soothingly at his little brother. I'm glad he's here, he mumbled. Even when you've taught him everything he needs to know, I wouldn't mind letting you come around every once in a while to keep a low profile, hero killer. Stain quietly gulped and leaned back against the wall, relaxing a little. Putting his guard down at last. Akaguro is fine. Leaping off the dike fastly, Midoriya gracefully landed on the tip of another with one foot. The buff villain let out a deep roar and slammed his fists into the ground, creating more dikes sharper than the others. What the hell? Bakugo watched from the ground with gritted teeth, seeing that his enemy had become so swiftly agile. He only became angrier seeing wires spring out from the tips of his gloves as they whipped around, slicing off the fuses in the strands of hair being flung at him from the woman. Though one hair made it and exploded at the base of the dike, making him bounce off again. He maneuvered himself upside down in the air with an innocent smile. With one hand, he reached for the buff villain and watched 5 strings whip around him and then suddenly ensnaring him. His legs were tied together and he fell on his side unbalanced. His arms were tangled to keep him from punching the ground. He was immobilized. Midoriya then used his other hand to have the wires wrap around a street lamp. He pulled himself over to it while still in the air, letting himself swing from it and land perfectly on top of it. He sat down with a mischievous smirk as the strings from the street lamp retracted back to the metal tips. Why, you little brat? The woman shrieked. You should be looking at me, lady. Shinso came out behind the dike and revealed himself in the open, getting the female villain's attention. I don't see much dash before she could finish what she had to say. She became stunned and entranced. That was almost a little too easy for him. He would make one efficient hero. Midoriya let his legs dangle and swing as he sat on the street lamp, patiently waiting for heroes to show up. He couldn't exactly leave because he was using one hand to keep a villain secured. So he just played on his phone with one gloveless hand. And Bakugo's blood was boiling just looking at him. A cocky little brat who's never had a quirk or muscle in his life was able to restrain a villain at least 5 times his size without getting a scratch on him. All while he would have gotten in trouble for using his power. He had been the powerless one here. You guys were totally amazing. Kaminari cheered with wide eyes full of awe. He ran up to Shinso with balled fists. You didn't even hesitate. You guys are in the general studies, right? You guys are really just hero hopefuls like us. Shinso took a step back, taken aback by this bright enthusiasm. Dude, where did you get those? They're awesome. Kirishima called up to Midoriya with an equal level of brightness. He seemed like a pretty sweet guy. They were a gift from my tutor. They are pretty awesome. It looked like he wanted to ask more, but he suddenly started getting pulled away by his hand by Bakugo. You gotta tell me more sometime. Kirishima looked at Bakugo, baffled, but shrugged it off as he was being dragged away. He waved to Midoriya with a big smile. The little villain waved back sweetly. Soon enough, heroes did come to take the villains away and free the hostages. Midoriya came down from the lamppost by sliding down the pole ever so gracefully. He was praised by heroes after initially being scolded. They had thought he used a quirk, but he technically broke no rule with the gloves. And thus he was praised. Though this annoyed him a great deal despite not showing any hint of it. They only praised him because they knew he wouldn't get the credit for it. They would. He didn't steal their kill. Their profit. Their fame. They would take the fruits of his labor and all the media attention. Shinso just pretended that he never did anything and straight up lied about using a quirk because there was no physical evidence. I heard you weren't interested in making any friends back at the restaurant. Kaminari went up to him afterward, playing with his hands a bit. And I've heard some things about you that I don't think are true. He knew people didn't like or trust the purple-haired boy. But for what it's worth, I like you, dude. I think you're pretty amazing. You should totally hang with us sometime. With a big smile, he pulled out his phone. Can I have your number? He giggled cheekily. Shinso didn't notice the thumbs-up Kirishima and Siro were giving Kaminari from behind. The tired boy was a bit stunned by the offer, blankly staring at the one in front of him. Sure. Both the squad and the duo walked back to the restaurant together. Siro and Kaminari walked in the middle with Bakugo and Midoriya walking the farthest apart from each other. Kirishima, Siro, and Kaminari talked loudly and enthusiastically about what had just happened with Shinso occasionally nodding and making minimalist comments awkwardly. The other two walked silently, refusing to look in each other's direction. Though there was just a single moment, one tiny moment, where they made eye contact. Bakugo had silently reacted with a shiver as Midoriya smiled inhumanely wide with bloody red hues. But by the time the blonde blinked, the freckled boy was calmly grinning at the talkative bunch with a curious, innocent gaze, even chuckling at one of Kaminari's jokes. Kirishima blinked when he felt his hand be held and then saw Bakugo glaring in Midoriya's direction. In returning to the fast food place, Midoriya and Shinso sat back down at their table with the squad going back to their own. And while the little villain finished reading the journal, Shinso was receiving lots of texts all of a sudden. Who could guess from who? I think you're really on the right track. From what I've gathered, I think we should start looking into Class 1B since we know it can't be from 1A or our class. And even though the masked one sounded like a boy, they were wearing a voice mixer. They could have been wearing a wig or a binder. Shinso nodded, taking his journal back and making a few notes. I never thought about the binder part. But we're also looking for someone with a quirk that doesn't change their bodily appearance. Midoriya folded his arms and nodded his head. You got it. Midoriya returned to the hideout later that evening with quite the giddy smile on his face. The improvement he had shown himself and the bitterness he caused Bakugo to feel had him elated. Shigaraki had been at the bar without the hand on his face and on his phone when the little villain sat beside him. Someone's in a good mood. You sure you didn't sneak out with your Prince Charming? He asked. Midoriya shook his head. I did not. He hummed. It wasn't long until Kurogiri came out of a back room with a full meal for the smiling doctor. And he was confident that he'd eat all of it. He had been much better about eating since his more serious relationship with Todoroki and Stain's guidance. Akaguro wants to take you to Hosu with him 2 days from now. Shigaraki began. Midoriya nodded while he ate when he suddenly froze. He'd love to go with his master on a mission. He had been expecting it. But then there was a moment of panic. That was the same day as the sports festival. I'm gonna call up twice again. Don't worry about missing out on watching over your Prince Charming. Midoriya appeared visibly relieved as he hunched over and made an exhausted face with chopsticks in his mouth. Way to cause a heart attack. If he had to choose between Stain and Todoroki, he wasn't sure if he'd be able to do it. And Kurogiri will be on backup so he can take you back and to the school as soon as you're done. And Shigaraki put his cheek in his hand, smirking at his little brother. Afterward, you can go see your little prince again. Midoriya sat straight up and his face was beaming. It had been 3 weeks since being able to see Todoroki after school or on weekends. It was becoming torturous despite him being used to it. He had been craving him for more than usual. To hold his hand for more than a few minutes, to snuggle against each other, to let him take a nap on him, playing with Zuzu together, walking and shopping together, but just being near him. He couldn't stop thinking about him. He had gotten more physically affectionate at school despite only having less than an hour to each other a day. He may lose himself when they could finally have the time and privacy. Midoriya slurped down the rest of the noodles on the plate, finishing his meal completely and wiping his face. You're gonna be pretty busy during the festival, aren't you? You have to scan the massive crowd for someone we don't know. They're missing Todoroki. Shigaraki was betting on their person of interest being at the festival to watch his littlest brother compete. He didn't know what he was really looking for. Someone's appearance can change so drastically after adulthood. This one's been missing since his first year in high school. And they were only running on Todoroki Shudo's hunch that he was still alive. Someone who would have disappeared when he was between the ages of 6 and 7. Todoroki's memory was not very credible when it was that far back with trauma that must have been repressed. I'm honestly going to have to count on Endeavor to make a move. People's reactions to him are going to be my opening. Midoriya nodded while hearing Shigaraki's plan. Everything was going to be based on chance. Having discussed the game plan of the sports festival, Midoriya jumped off the stool and stretched. My subject's body is starting to wear out. It's decaying pretty fast, so this'll probably be my last night with it, he said so casually. Shigaraki shrugged with a smirk. He was pretty proud of how productive his little brother had been lately. I'll find you another one soon. You want to go get it yourself? It was the first time he's offered something like that. Midoriya's eyes gleamed, staring at his big brother in shock. Did he think he was ready? Did he trust him to do it himself? Why, yeah, I do. A smile crept upon his face as he balled his fists. I won't let you down, Tomo. I promise. Shigaraki twitched at the nickname. One would think he would be used to it by now. He wasn't. Midoriya went right to the elevator, giddy as ever to go to work, leaving his big brother traumatized and lifeless. I'm not quite sure what your thought process is, but it looks like it's working, Kurogiri commented, bringing Shigaraki a small strawberry shortcake. The most villainous food. Shigaraki slowly got a hold of himself and ate a forkful of cream. How so? He asked. He's happier. You pried him away from Todoroki and yet he's been more enthusiastic and passionate. He's gotten stronger and more capable. And from my perspective, you've matured very quickly since he's improved. Being a big brother and a boss took responsibility. Had he been alone with just his bartender babysitter, his maturity would not have risen so efficiently. He even formed a friendly relationship with a serial killer that tried to kill him within the first 10 minutes of meeting him. Had he been his old self, they'd be at each other's throats. The core of Izuku's emotional problems was his sense of weakness. He clung to his beloved Prince Charming because he felt like he was finally making an impact. He correlates results with power. If Midoriya wasn't making positive results, then he wasn't strong. Todoroki told him he could make an impact, even if he was quirkless. He was finally making an impact by himself, with power. With Stain. I wanted him to only focus on making himself stronger. I knew it would make him feel better. He starved himself slaving over a desk, desperate to make an impact. Punishing himself and pushing himself in order to make that impact Todoroki told him that he could make. But I'm also counting on their separation for something else. Shigaraki took another bite of cake and held up his fork, pointing it at an upward angle while he was hunched over with his chin in his hand, elbow resting on the counter. I'm no expert in teenage romance. But people always say that annoying line, distance makes the heart grow fonder. I'm counting on that theory and Izuku's inability to control himself around his prince. Kurogiri had been shining a glass when he suddenly paused. He wanted to think about that statement very carefully. Shigaraki Tamura, are you? Was he emotionally manipulating two teenagers like this? Two boys obsessed with each other were likely more madly in love and craving each other more than they ever had before. They'll reunite closer than they ever knew. There's nothing little Aizawa hates more than feeling weak and small. It's why he likes to play with his dolls down there. Kurogiri's yellow eyes narrowed. He wasn't sure how to feel about where Shigaraki was going with this. He likes power. To dominate. While this conversation was taking place, Midoriya was spinning in a desk chair that he had at his desk with something a bit bulky in his lap. I get to see Shochan, I get to see Shochan, he sang, going in circles in his chair childishly before hugging onto himself and tilting his head to the side. His adorable eyes had a beautiful minty glow in the dimness of his laboratory, half-lidded as his mind drifted in a bit of deeper thought. I get to see Shochan. His grip on his side and his opposite shoulder tightened at his fingertips. The chair stopped spinning as his thighs came together but his feet angled away from each other. He giggled quietly, yet so lovingly. My beautiful hero. He hadn't noticed the speck of drool escaping his lips, having been so far lost in his imagination. He did all this with a severed head of a hero resting on his lap, its mouth gaping open as if it was screaming the moment they died. After his mind flowed out of his romantic and obsessive thoughts, he used his scalpel to then start cutting out the eyes of the head, taking notes at his desk with a stack of papers that had already been written, typed, printed, and organized for Shigaraki next to him. The next morning came about so quickly. No kissing, no hugging, don't even get within a few feet of him. I can't let the first time he sees me after school be with a clone, no offense. But I worry he may find out or get upset. Midoriya lectured his clone. Shigaraki, twice, and Kurogiri were at the bar while the little villain was laying down the rules while in his villain costume. The clone smirked and nodded. Yeah, I get it, it answered without complaint. And maybe help Toma find our person of interest while you're there. You're not participating, just taking notes for class with the crowds. Try to find anyone that looks like they have some serious trauma. Midoriya suggested. The clone winked. Roger that. They shared a high five and the clone Midoriya in its gray uniform ran out the door, waving goodbye to everyone. Twice was dressed casually except for the mask over his head as Shigaraki sat next to him with his father on his face. Seems like you two got big plans. Kinda cute how you're getting along with your clone. Disgusting. Twice commented with his other self coming out for a moment. We appreciate the help. It's because of you that I get to do stuff like this. Midoriya thanked him with a sparkle in his eye. He couldn't be more grateful. It made the older villain lean back and rub the back of his head, clearly blushing under that mask. Stop. It's no biggie. Tell me more. What Shigaraki found annoying in Twice's personalities, Midoriya found it kind of funny. He snickered at him but not meanly. It wasn't too soon after that Twice got off the bar stool and gestured a wave to Shigaraki. Call me anytime. I'll tell Jiren you said hi. The little villain waved to him as he exited. Shigaraki removed the hand from his face with a sigh. He wanted to make eye contact with Midoriya but only saw his little brother with his nose deep in his phone. The little villain wanted to send a quick text to Todoroki before the start of the sports festival. You'll do great today. Look for me. The little villain blushed and giggled as he held his phone close to his chest. Shigaraki only smirked and shook his head at the love-struck teenager. By the time Midoriya lifted his head, he noticed the door too. The bar was open with Stain leaning against the frame of it, one foot against it with him. His arms were folded and he appeared pretty serious until he made a smirk. Are you ready, Fallen? He asked. The little villain slipped his gloves on, flexing his fingers to make sure they were snug in his weapon. He then jogged over to his teacher, waving goodbye to Shigaraki happily. He couldn't be any more excited. Before they left together through Kurogiri's portal, Stain glanced back, sharing a nod with the villain sitting at the bar. Midoriya would be brought back safely. This left the clone to whatever work there was to be done at the sports festival, that being, supporting the original's boyfriend all he can from the stands. Surrounded by scouting heroes and a public eager for entertaining, the fake sat amongst them with a notebook in hand with an earpiece in. His eyes scanned the face around him, looking for anyone interesting or suspicious. Let me know if you find anyone. We're looking for someone who managed to either fake his death or cheat death entirely, Shigaraki said through the earpiece device. The clone nodded, making eye contact with a security camera that was pointed directly at him. Shigaraki was watching everything up close with his own personal view. They both would take notice of the flaming hero a few columns over standing behind everyone, glaring down at the arena down below. It's like watching a dog fight, Shigaraki commented. Watching teenagers just beating the shit out of each other for recognition. The original Midoriya would probably lose his cool halfway in watching Todoroki participate. The clone would show a little more composure, though it did grit its teeth seeing the first match being an obstacle race. Seeing all the students get squished together in the entrance, scrambling and shoving to be the first one out like a bunch of animals made its infatuated stomach turn. Todoroki was in that pile of students somewhere. But seeing how he was the first one out, freezing the path behind him, the clone clasped its hands together in pride and astonishment. You show them, Shochun, it swooned. Watching him take down a giant robot in one move, cross a ravine without issue, and make it to a landmine field before anyone else, the real Midoriya would be so proud. Though it gritted its teeth watching Bakugo catch up to him. They got into a bit of a tussle in the minefield, pulling hair and grabbing at each other to throw one another off balance. Todoroki eventually made a wall of ice in front of Bakugo when he was busy pulling his hair so he would crash into it and lose composure in the air. The blonde shattered it but stumbled and lost his momentum, eventually landing him in second place. Watching a replay of him face planting in the dirt made the clone laugh and clap its hands, enjoying every bit of the student's failure. Although that laughter quickly changed to anger as a cavalry battle was the next event. It would have been fine if Ida wasn't one of the 3 horses for Todoroki. Even if it wasn't the original, the clone knew the real Midoriya would be furious and it reflected all of his would-be emotions. The idea of Ida being a horse for Todoroki to ride, it made the fake cringe and blush. Don't fuck this up for him, Four Eyes. And don't think that this makes you better than the real me. It growled. All of the students had target Todoroki for having the most points, but he did well to keep his distance and fend off all the other competitors. Thankfully, Bakugo was too busy going feral against a Class 1B student to pay attention to Todoroki for the majority of the event. By the time he had retrieved his stolen bands, he didn't have enough time to reach the half-and-half boy. The clone was sure to cheer loudly with the rest of the crowd as Todoroki and his team won first place. Aizu clone, do you see anything? Shigaraki asked through the earpiece. The clone snapped out of its cheering and took a moment to move its attention to the surrounding crowd. Boy, were they all going wild. A few heroes were being more analytical, silently judging all of the teenagers and their attempts to succeed. So it was best to search for someone who didn't look like a hero and someone who wasn't cheering. This person was likely trying to stay on the down low. He was able to stay hidden for this long, so he must have been good about not sticking out. Near endeavor. Would the missing son be near his monstrous father? The clone turned to see the flaming hero standing sternly and seriously. Between everyone wearing costumes and everyone looking unique with body-altering quirks, it was having a difficult picking one person out. However, it would notice someone wearing all black, leaning back in their seat calmly, clapping their hands slowly. It squinted to get a closer look at the hands. Purple markings and staples? They looked like burns. Check the middle row, 2 columns to the left of endeavor. There's someone in a black jacket with sunglasses and a black flu mask, it said, holding a button on the earpiece. It watched a security camera turn to where it directed. And back at the hideout, Shigaraki was in his room on his computer in the darkness. He had a picture of the missing Todoroki from middle school next to him as a reference. His screen consisted of the view of every security camera in the arena. I can't see his face for shit, he grumbled, scratching at his neck. He couldn't be focusing on one person the whole time. What if it was the wrong person? The real one could slip out and he'd be lost forever. I'll keep an eye on him. Keep looking, the clone said. It peeked back at Endeavor. They would just have to wait for a big reaction from the pro to spark something. And that reaction would eventually come. Endeavor had left the seating area for a few minutes before Todoroki's first round. No one had really taken notice. And just as Todoroki went up to take on Shirohanta, the round didn't last longer than a minute. Todoroki appeared so angry to the crowd, sending a massive spiked glacier right at the poor student, freezing him and half the stadium solid. Everyone had felt such pity for poor Shiro. He didn't stand a chance. The whole arena began cheering, "Don't worry about it," in the hopes of lessening the mental toll of losing so quickly. To the clone, however, it saw not anger, but sadness. The real Midoriya was going to be very upset when he came back. The student that was forced to face Todoroki after Shiro met the same fate so quickly as well. Ida also fell to him as he underestimated his close-range skills. The clone evilly smirked at the sight. It hoped the four-eyed loser felt embarrassed and ashamed for doubting Todoroki. His ribs were healed and he could do more than fight from a distance. But when it came to the fourth match, something was definitely wrong. No one could hear Todoroki and Bakugo, the two finalists, from where they were. The stadium was too large. The crowds were too noisy. But the two of them were talking, though it appeared to mostly be Bakugo just yelling at him. When the match started, they didn't fight right away. There was an argument to be had. Shigaraki took the time to get into a closer camera to see if he could hear anything. "You used your fire against Kosuka all that time ago. You have it. You can fucking use it. Don't you dare come at me with only half force. I refuse to win to that because that's not really winning." Todoroki had looked so saddened at that point. There must have been a lot on his mind. "Don't give me that depressed-ass look. Get pissed off. Come at me." The night Todoroki became engulfed by anger, the night he and Midoriya vandalized and spray-painted a back alley, Midoriya wanted him to do the same thing. Get angry. Let those emotions show. I won't, Todoroki growled, clenching both his fists. Not when he's here. Bakugo did not like that answer at all. Todoroki tried to freeze him with a giant glacier the moment he denied the blonde's request. The two went at it, Todoroki's ice being melted and broken by the other's explosions and aggressive maneuvers. The clone reached for its wrist, seeing Todoroki be tossed across the arena, skidding in the dirt but keeping himself in bounds with an ice wall. But Bakugo didn't want to give him the time to recover. He went for the throat, but Todoroki dived out of the way, shielding himself with more ice. It got to a point where he wasn't fighting anymore, just defending himself. Bakugo was too fast, too aggressive, unwilling to break for 1 second. There was no opportunity to fight back. He was just getting backed into a corner. Seeing the beautiful boy so helpless, so in denial to fight, the clone couldn't control itself. The real Midoriya in it couldn't control himself either. Beat his ass, Shochan. Do your best, it screamed at the top of its lungs, letting its voice ring out louder than any others. Its voice had gained everyone's attention. But the crowd's focus was soon pried away as the stadium began to heat up faster and faster, intensely. Bakugo had to back up to where he started, covering his face with his forearms from the wild temperature. The audience recoiled, ducking their heads and blocking their faces from the bright flames. Midoriya's influence had the power here. Endeavor couldn't convince him to use his fire. Bakugo couldn't berate him enough to make him use it. Todoroki would only listen to Midoriya. He would do anything he said. If he wanted him to slaughter Bakugo, the one that sent him to the roof of that middle school that rainy day, Todoroki would mutilate him. The love and support were more addicting. He was on strings wrapped around his fingers. However, the shame tied those strings into knots. The sense of failure made Todoroki feel like he was suffocating, drowning. The clone turned to Endeavor, hearing the most awful booming voice come from him. Shuto. Finally, his father's call was louder with a smile and pride. It was more powerful. As the pro's flames rose, his sons died. The pillar of swirling flames had disappeared with the wind without a spark left behind. Bakugo was left stunned with the rest of the crowd. Todoroki stood still in silence, his eyes suddenly appearing as dead as his fire. Midoriya's love wasn't enough. It wasn't strong enough. The fire was gone. The fire of his left half and the fire in his heart, his fire to fight had been extinguished. The clone looked hopelessly at the battlefield, gripping the safety railing in front of it. Its lips quivered as it watched Todoroki just stand there. He raised his right hand slowly, weakly. But the ice that came from him was sharp and fast, blasting right at Bakugo. "Don't you fucking dare! Bring it back!" Bakugo screamed, launching himself forward at full speed, sparking his hand up for max power. "Esicho-chan?" The clone whimpered, watching its beloved get blasted back in the frozen field. He was knocked completely unconscious. It shut its eyes, tears escaping them as it ran out of its seat and up the stairs. It had to go see him. As soon as the match was over, it had to go. Suddenly, it stopped at the top of the steps. Midoriya told it not to. Midoriya himself needed to see Shudo before anyone else. But Todoroki needed him now. "Get the real one here. Now," the clone screamed into the earpiece. "Shochan needs him right now." Shigaraki watched all the cameras, looking for any reaction from a few suspicious people around the arena. Endeavor's blow-up of pride had been heard by everyone. Come on, he muttered to himself, anxiously scratching at his neck. This was the best opportunity. This was his only opportunity. "You have to be here, that's your little brother." And that was when his red eyes snapped open wide. The black jacket and sunglasses figure he was gripping the back of his seat, turned back and aggressively baring his fist close to his chest. It was just a second. It was only a second. But just the smallest blue ember flew out from the crevices of his fingers. That quirk, blue flames. The way he was looking at Endeavor. It had to be. "I got him." The widest grin rose on his face. Todoroki Shudo would be his now with his big brother alive and well. Then he recoiled, hearing the clone scream in his ear from the earpiece. Too loud. "He's coming. I'll get Kurogiri dash." In an alleyway in the center of Hosu, the pro-hero Ingenium had been slain. In the darkness, a pool of blood was at Stain's feet as he had blood dripping from his tongue. A news reel was displayed on a skyscraper in the distance, sequencing through news stories and the weather. A segment consisted of a crime scene left behind in another part of Hosu by the hero killer. The jet-elbowed pro made the mistake of turning in the alley by himself. Even then, his sidekicks would have likely been slaughtered as well. They stood no chance against the two before him. He found himself, barely conscious and dangling in the air by thin wires restraining his every limb. He could not move regardless, paralyzed by Stain's quirk. Parts of his armor had been removed. Stain's blade was at his tongue. "Don't make a sound," the man threatened. The villains didn't want to risk getting caught. But keeping silent proved to be very difficult for the pro as he briefly cried out as his arms were ripped open from a scalpel. Midoriya, armed with his beloved gloves and masks, was digging through the engines in his elbows, doing research on the ground rather than in the lab. "How interesting, there's metal in your body," the little villain mused. "Stop." Ingenium growled, only to have Stain further push his sword closer to his tongue. "Maybe just a little?" There was a disgusting sound of something inside his arm being cut. The little villain giggled to himself, digging around with his scalpel carelessly, taking far more joy in the hero's suffering than actually collecting data on him. Ida Tenia's poor big brother. How he loved that Stain was targeting this man. What a way to torment his little brother. Ingenium choked on blood as Stain stabbed his stomach to force blood up his throat instead of screams of pain. "You'll make a good warning to this city," Stain muttered. He then looked over to his student who proudly held all the engine parts in Ingenium's arms in his hands. He had cut them all out, leaving jagged and heavily bleeding wounds in his wake. Chunks of flesh and muscle were still attached to the parts, some falling off onto the pavement. He must have cut a few nerves. Stain had probably done the same as there were more wounds scattered about the hero's body. He wouldn't be a hero anymore. Not with these injuries. He was better off dead. "Now then," Stain started to say when his attention was taken elsewhere. "I saw him go this way. I think I heard something." Backup was to come. And though the two villains could take them on, there wasn't much of a point to it. They left their mark and their warning, so there was nothing left to do here. Guess we gotta go, master? Midoriya mumbled, sounding disappointed. He wanted to stay a little longer and finish the job. But Shigaraki probably wanted him back soon. More than anything, however, he longed to see Todoroki now that he was no longer restricted. So he stuffed the bloody engine parts in his shirt and retracted the wires from his gloves, letting Ingenium's mutilated body fall to the ground. Stain patted the boy's shoulder, receiving a nod from his student before they both fled the scene just as the hero's backup turned the corner. They leaped up off the walls of the alleys and balconies, ran across rooftops and billboard ledges, Stain taking refuge on a tall telephone pole downtown looking over the city while Midoriya hung upside by his legs on a nearby balcony ledge. The little villain took out his phone and took a quick peek at the live stream of the sports festival, smiling under his mask and expecting all good things. His smile dropped when he saw the medals being handed out. Second place? And what was that look on Todoroki's face? He looked miserable. Oh no, he mumbled. Master, he called out, gaining Stain's attention. I need to go see Shudo. Can I be dismissed? He asked. The hero killer nodded silently, granting him permission to leave. He would choose to stay in Hosu for a little longer, wanting to linger for more time. Midoriya was about to call Kurogiri when the villain's portal appeared next to him. The clone is requesting you right away, the dark fogman explained. The freckled boy removed his upper facial mask, revealing an expression of panic. He would ask what happened, but he felt that there was no time to ask. He knew where he needed to be. Please get changed. I will bring you to the mansion as soon as you're prepared. He nodded and swung himself forward and back to launch himself into the portal and reappear at the bar where he left all of Ingenium's stolen body parts on the counter. He trusted Kurogiri to clean it up later, knowing how excessively tidy he liked to keep his bar. Going to his room, Midoriya began to strip and redress as quick as possible. What's going on? He asked. The clone was standing in the corner of his bedroom, watching him shamelessly, appearing to be panicked and stressed, scratching the sides of its head with both hands. The endeavor freaked him out. Kaken tried getting him to use his fire against him in the final match, but he didn't want to. Did you tell him to beat his ass? I did. But then Endeavor said something louder than me. I can tell it upset him. He completely gave up mid-fight. And he got second place, which means his old man is going to be pissed. You have to get him. The clone explained, taking the stripped-off villain costume off the floor and hanging it up for him. The quicker he changed and cleaned up, the quicker he could get to the boyfriend. The fucking... Midoriya growled to himself, throwing on the gray blazer and not even bothering with the tie. Did we find his brother? Was there at least a positive in all of this? The clone balled its fists to its chest and smiled at last. With a smile and a nod, it beamed. We did. Great work then, the freckled doctor complimented. The clone grinned softly and clasped its hands together. Go get him, it hummed before it started melting away to the floor. Midoriya was warped to the front gate by Kurogiri. Looking down at his phone, the little villain looked over the several texts he had sent Todoroki asking where was and if he could come out. There was no answer. He sat against the outside of the wall around his mansion waiting for a response. Where are you? Are you okay? What happened? Shochan? I'm worried. I'm here. There was no response to any of them. None of them read. But the sun was starting to set. He had to be home by now. He gulped as he rubbed the side of his head, peeking around the corner of the gate to see the front door of the mansion. His beloved was in there. He knew it. But was he willing to actually break into Endeavor's property to go see Todoroki? They'd be home. The door would be unlocked. Endeavor was inside. If he got caught, he would be as good as dead. Midoriya left his shoes under a bush in the front garden right next to the gate. He hopped the gate and landed gracefully on his feet, smirking. He wasn't able to do that last time he came here. He approached the front door and slowly opened it without a sound coming from it. Spying inside, there was no one in the entrance hall, just 3 pairs of shoes. He recognized Todoroki's were sloppily near the door, having been kicked off in a rush. Endeavor's were too. They must have gotten into an argument. Taking a deep breath, the little killer carefully tiptoed in and shut the door behind him. He was extra careful to shut the door silently when he jumped at the sound of a dog whine. Looking down at his feet, Zuzu was sitting on a rug, wagging her tail and panting. Shoo! Midoriya held a finger to his lips, hoping this dog was smart enough to keep quiet. He was going to get skinned alive if he was caught doing this. This was beyond trespassing. He'd be kicked out of UA for sure. But seeing Todoroki was worth every risk. However, now that he thought about it, this was a mansion and a giant one at that. He had no idea where Todoroki's room was supposed to be. This was such a stupid idea. Hey. Shudo, where's Shudo? He couldn't believe he was asking a dog for directions. Zuzu just tilted her head at him. Shudo. He covered his left eye with his hand. Shudo? He felt so stupid. And yet the little puppy walked around him, gave a lick on the hand, and then began to trot down the hall. Was he about to follow a dog and pray he didn't get caught by Fuyumi or Endeavor? He was. The little puppy took him upstairs first, making a lot of noise as she did so because she decided to run. Midoriya quivered at the noise. But it was the dog that made the noise. She's been in this house for more than a month, so the family must have been used to hearing her wander. They wouldn't suspect him. He was safe. This was fine. He followed her silently up the stairs, careful with every step avoid making a creak. She would then take him down another hall as she stopped at every door, turning her head to look inside every room they passed. Did she also avoid Endeavor? It made the villain wonder if the pro had ever hit her. Todoroki would have gotten very upset. And as they turned down another hall, Zuzu continued to stop at every door before her fur rose up. What are you doing? Endeavor's voice boomed. Midoriya froze against the wall, his heart falling into his stomach. He closed his eyes and stayed as still as possible. You idiot! Why didn't you keep looking for them? The hero killer and the League of Villains have teamed up and you ditched your search. On the phone. Endeavor was on the phone. Midoriya slowly slid down the wall to sit down and held his chest with one hand and covered his mouth with the other. Peeking around the corner, he saw Endeavor in a massive office, pacing back and forth looking pissed off. His hand was flexed with a flame rising from it and the fire on his face brighter than ever. I don't care about that. Do you realize how many people are in danger with those people working together? His whole body lit up at that moment. Midoriya took the chance to dash past the threshold, taking Zuzu in his arms. He was grateful Endeavor was so enraged that he was too distracted to notice the boy sneaking around his house. Having passed that obstacle, Zuzu was put down and allowed to guide the little villain the rest of the way to a closed door in a quiet part of the mansion. She scratched at the Japanese-style sliding door, but couldn't let herself in. She whined and bit at the wood to no avail. Midoriya pressed his forehead against the door and then turned his ear to it. He heard nothing. Was Todoroki hurt? Was that why he wasn't answering his phone? He checked his texts again and saw that none of them had been read still. But Zuzu didn't seem panicked, just desperate to see him. I'm coming in, he said quietly, sliding the door open. The puppy wandered right into the darkened room where not a single light was on. The only reason Midoriya could see inside was that the evening light was able to poke through his curtains, but it was still so dim. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to see, though he was surprised to see the little dog go up to a small pile of blankets in the middle of the floor. She used her nose to poke at the blankets, sneezed once, and then burrowed underneath making a few yips. It was followed by a soft groan. Zuzu, not now please, Todoroki whispered. Leave me alone. The little puppy was gently pushed out of the blankets, but she turned right back around to stick just her head underneath, leaving her wagging tail high in the air. She whined at him again before biting the blanket and giving it a good tug. Zuzu dash, she managed to pull a blanket away from Todoroki's face where he looked annoyed and tired like he was just trying to sleep. He had ice lightly coating his neck. When he tried to take the blanket back, he paused when he saw the freckled villain sitting on his knees beside him looking heartbroken. Izuku? There was immediate shock as he started to sit up. How did you get in here? My fetish. Midoriya wrapped his arms around his neck and shifted his weight to keep Todoroki from sitting up. I snuck in so we have to be quiet. But I just really needed to see you. You didn't answer your phone and after the festival, you looked a wreck. He felt how cold his neck and shoulders were. In pulling back he noticed the ice. This was a familiar wound. You both fought again. Todoroki looked away. He grabbed you by the neck again, didn't he? Midoriya lightly brushed his fingers against the solid ice covering his skin. He was mad. He didn't want me speaking to you ever again, so he took my phone, Todoroki explained. No wonder he never answered. Well, I'm here now, Midoriya said gently with a smile. He can't take you away from me, you know that? He leaned down to kiss his lips softly. He kept it short as he placed their foreheads together. Your fire was beautiful, just like you. But I don't blame you for shutting down. I know it's hard. He moved from his knees to sit down properly, his legs bent behind him and propping himself up with one hand. Todoroki stayed half laying down on his side. He was looking away at the floor when Zuzu approached him and nuzzled herself inside his shirt, her favorite place. He placed his hand over his shirt where she curled up. I couldn't even beat Bakugo for you, Todoroki mumbled sadly. Midoriya shook his head with closed eyes. I don't care about that, the little villain hummed. I was just worried about you. When he opened his eyes again, there was an intense minty glow in his irises as the sun was blocked by the back of his head. He placed a hand on his beloved's cheek and tilted his head. I got what I needed just by coming here to see you. Zuzu poked her head out the bottom of Todoroki's shirt, making eye contact with the little killer. She made a small huff before crawling out of his shirt and wandering back to the door where she nudged the crack of it open to get up. She scratched it a few times to shut it behind her. So, Sho-chan, do you need anything? Todoroki took a deep breath, his eyes becoming a bit hazy while looking at the glowing hues above him. He reached up to place his hand on the other's shoulder. Just you, he said quietly. His medicine always made him feel better. This boy always made the pain go away. They haven't had a moment to each other in privacy for almost a month, and now his beloved had snuck all the way into his house, into his room just to see him. He wanted to bring him closer. They had been separated for far too long. Could you come closer? He asked. He adored the little twinkle in the other's eye upon his request. Of course, his precious killer cooed, leaning in closer to him and sharing a kiss once again. Their kisses had been so short in passing time, rushing to get to class and making the affection short. There was no rush here. There was nothing but time. Time stood still for them in this room. A boy was at a hospital, watching his older brother drift in and out of life as his legs had been ripped to shreds. A villain and a hero kissed. An older brother, hiding from his past, was retreating to a dark alleyway with a bottle in one hand and a cigarette in another. A villain crawled into the blankets. A restless killer attached to the remains of the dead was passing screenshots of a mysterious man to an info broker. A hero pulled a villain closer down. Two teachers ate dinner together with a tired boy joining them for the evening, happily, while two parents, a dragon man and a normal woman, dined in silence with an extra chair at the table. A villain couldn't keep his hands to himself. A serial killer stood on a rooftop, observing the city he had yet to leave a mark on. A hero didn't mind. A ghostly bartender stood at his bar, shining a bottle, and saw the reflection on a blue-haired boy with a bandage on his nose that he did not recognize. Izuku, a black spiky-haired boy with golden eyes, sitting on a table in a lab far underground, where he didn't belong. Izuku, what about the old Ma-dash? The villain covered his beautiful hero's mouth and held a finger to his own smiling lips. He sat on top of him, legs on either side of him with his head tilted so innocently. You'll just have to be quiet, Sho-chan, he giggled, placing his hand down at the center of Todoroki's chest. But don't think about him. I'm the only one you should be thinking about. His index finger forced the collar of his white shirt down. I haven't spent time with you in so long, and that's all we have now. I'm here now.